She had crossed half a continent for a man who looked right through her. Clara Bennett stood on the platform at Harlow Creek, Colorado, with a worn leather trunk at her feet and 3 months of letters pressed against her chest, and she watched the man she had come to marry walk away with another woman on his arm. No explanation, no apology, just the back of his coat disappearing into the crowd while the whole town watched. She was 28 years old, alone in a place she had never been, and the life she had packed into that trunk suddenly felt like something she had invented, something that had never been real at all. If you've ever been left standing somewhere you didn't belong, with nothing but your own 2 feet to carry you forward, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because Clara Bennett's journey is one that will stay with you long after it's over. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The train from Denver had taken 11 hours. 11 hours of rattling windows and coal smoke, and a bench seat that had left Clara's back aching in ways she suspected would not resolve quickly. She had spent most of the journey with her forehead against the glass, watching the landscape shift from the familiar green of the east into something altogether different, wide and pale and enormous, the kind of country that made a person feel very small, very fast. She had tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. It wasn't like her to be impulsive. Clara Bennett had spent most of her adult life being the opposite of impulsive. She had been practical, methodical, and steady in ways that people mistook for contentment when they were really just the habits of someone who had learned early not to want too much. She had worked as a school teacher in Philadelphia for 6 years, living in a rented room above a dry goods store, sending money home to her mother until her mother passed, and then sending it nowhere, saving it in a tin box under her floorboard while she tried to figure out what came next. What came next had started as an advertisement in the back of a weekly paper. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been reading about rail prices, and the ad had simply been there on the same page, and something in the wording had snagged her attention before she could scroll past it. Rancher, Colorado Territory, 34 years of age, seeks wife of good character and sound mind. No flighty temperament. Honest correspondence only. Reply to one James Aldridge, Harlow Creek. She had told herself she was only curious. Then she had written back. James Aldridge's first letter had been brief and businesslike. He wrote the way a man writes when he isn't accustomed to it. Short sentences, cramped handwriting, words spelled correctly but placed on the page like stones. He had a cattle operation outside of Harlow Creek. He had been married before and his wife had died of fever 3 winters back. He had 2 hired men and a house that needed a woman in it if it was going to be a home rather than just a place where he slept. Clara had appreciated the honesty. She had seen the correspondence ads that read like poetry and smelled like desperation. James Aldridge's letter smelled like neither. It smelled like work. She had written back again and then again. Over the course of 12 weeks, they had exchanged 9 letters. Not love letters. Clara wouldn't have known how to write one if she'd tried, and she suspected James wouldn't have known how to receive one. They were practical letters. Letters about what she could do and what she expected in return. He had written that he wasn't a man who raised his voice or his hand. She had written that she wasn't a woman who required poetry, but that she did require honesty. He had agreed. She had packed her trunk. It had seemed, if not romantic, then at least sound. She had not been prepared for the platform at Harlow Creek. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. 2 rows of wooden buildings facing each other across a dirt street wide enough to turn a wagon, a water tower, a general store with a faded sign, a saloon with a piano she could hear from the platform. The whole thing sat in a shallow valley with red rock walls rising on 3 sides, and the afternoon sun hit those walls in a way that made the whole town look like it was blushing. Clara had stepped off the train with her trunk and her satchel and her 3 months of letters folded inside her coat pocket. She had looked for a man matching the description James had given her. Tall, light hair, a gray hat he said he always wore. She had spotted him almost immediately. He was standing near the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, and her first thought was that he looked younger than 34, and her second thought was that he looked nervous, and her third thought was cut short by the woman. She was perhaps 19, maybe 20, dark-haired and rosy-cheeked and dressed in a yellow cotton dress that had no business being practical in a cattle town, but that looked, Clara had to admit, quite pretty. She came around the side of the station building at a near run, and James Aldridge turned when he heard her footsteps, and the expression that crossed his face was not the expression of a man greeting a stranger. Clara stood very still. She watched James take 3 long steps toward the young woman. She watched him take both her hands. She watched him say something that made the young woman laugh, a high, bright laugh that carried across the platform like a thrown stone. And then she watched him put his arm around the woman's waist and steer her away from the platform entirely, as though the train had not arrived at all. He did not look back. There were perhaps a dozen people on that platform. A station master with a clipboard, 2 women in bonnets with a collection of parcels between them, a group of men near the freight car, a boy of about 10 sitting on a barrel. Every single one of them had seen it. Clara felt her face go hot. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry then, but she felt the pressure behind her eyes that always came before it, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose until it passed. She looked down at her trunk. She looked at her hands. She thought very clearly and almost calmly, I have $17.40, and I am standing in a town I do not know, and I have nowhere to go. Then the boy on the barrel said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, Mr. Aldridge walked right past you, didn't he? He did, Clara said. You come a long way. From Philadelphia. The boy made a sound that was almost a whistle. That's real far. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. She picked up her satchel. She left the trunk where it was because she couldn't carry both, and she needed her hands free, and she needed, above all, to look like she was going somewhere, rather than standing in the wreckage of a plan she should have examined more carefully. She walked off the platform with her spine straight and her chin level, and she did not look at the 2 women in bonnets who were whispering, and she did not look back at her trunk, and she absolutely did not look in the direction James Aldridge had gone. She walked down the main street of Harlow Creek and tried to think. The general store was the first thing she passed, then a land office, then a building with no sign that smelled like leather, a saddle maker, maybe. Then a small building with a woman sweeping the step who looked up at Clara with no particular expression and then looked away. Clara kept walking. At the end of the block, she stopped and turned around because she had run out of street and she needed a moment to assess. She had $17.40. She had no job. She had no acquaintance in this town beyond a man who had just publicly pretended she didn't exist. She could buy a ticket back to Denver. She had enough for that. From Denver, she could write to the school board in Philadelphia and ask for her position back. Though Mrs. Hannigan had filled it by now, everyone had assumed she wasn't coming back. She could write to her cousin Eleanor in Baltimore, who had a spare room and a husband who had never liked Clara much, but who would probably not let her starve. The life she had left was still there, in pieces, waiting to be reassembled. The thought made her feel so tired that she had to stop walking. She was standing in front of the saloon. Through the window she could see the interior, dark wood, a long bar, 3 or 4 men at tables, a woman in a red dress refilling glasses. A man came out the door as Clara stood there and gave her a look she was familiar with. The particular look men gave to women standing alone in places they weren't supposed to be. And she met his gaze steadily until he looked away and walked on. She needed, at minimum, a place to sleep tonight. She went into the saloon. The barkeep was a woman, which she hadn't expected. A tall, wide-shouldered woman of around 50 with gray-streaked hair pulled back hard and an expression that suggested she had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. She was wiping down the bar when Clara came in, and she looked up without any particular shift in her expression. "We don't serve rooms," she said. "I'm not looking for a drink," Clara said, "or a room. I'm looking for information, if you have a moment." The woman studied her. "You're the one from the platform." Clara had expected this. A town this size, news traveled at the speed of eyeballs. "Yes." Aldridge's mail order. The phrasing stung a little, though it was technically accurate. "Yes." The woman, her name was Ruth, as it turned out, Ruth Calloway, no relation to any Calloway Clara would meet later, set down her rag and put both hands flat on the bar and looked at Clara in a way that was assessing rather than unkind. "You got money?" "Some. Not much." "Family here?" "No." "Where are you sleeping tonight?" "I was hoping you might know of somewhere," Clara said. "A boarding house, or a family that takes in. Millie Pierce takes in women sometimes," Ruth said. "Other end of town, blue door, you can't miss it. She charges $2 a week and she'll want the first week up front. Ruth paused. She's nosy. You'll have to answer a lot of questions. I can manage that. And she doesn't like her boarders coming in after 9 o'clock. I'm not the type to be out after 9. Ruth looked at her a moment longer. Then she said, You want a cup of coffee while you get yourself together? Clara, who had not eaten since that morning, and who was beneath all the controlled composure, considerably more shaken than she was showing, said, Yes, thank you. She sat at the far end of the bar, and Ruth brought coffee and, without being asked, a plate with 2 biscuits and some cold chicken left from the midday meal. Clara ate with careful restraint and thought about what she was going to do. The situation was not, she told herself, catastrophic. It was bad. It was deeply unpleasant and more than a little humiliating, and she would likely be replaying the moment on that platform for weeks, the way James Aldridge had simply turned away as though she were a piece of scenery. But it was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Her father had died when she was 11 and left the family with almost nothing. Her mother had died last winter in a cold room with a bad roof, and Clara had been there for it, had sat beside the bed for 3 days while her mother faded, and had walked out of that room alone into a street that didn't care what she'd just lost. She had survived those things. She could survive a man who'd changed his mind. The harder question was what came after surviving. She could not return to Philadelphia. She knew that even as she turned the idea over. Not because she couldn't, technically. She could. But because she understood, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, that if she got back on a train east right now, she would never stop feeling like someone who had tried once and failed. She had not come all this way to add another chapter to a story about retreat, but she had no plan and very little money, and she was sitting in a saloon in a Colorado cattle town, while outside the man who had promised her a future walked around with another woman on his arm. She was still working on the second biscuit when the door opened. The man who came in was not young, maybe late 30s, maybe 40. It was hard to tell with men who spent most of their time outdoors, because the sun and the wind did something to them that made age hard to read. He was tall, lean in the way of people who worked physically without thinking about it, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that could have used a razor 2 days ago. His clothes were plain, canvas trousers, a dark work shirt, a coat that had seen considerable weather. He walked like a man who wasn't thinking about how he walked, which Clara had always found to be a reliable indicator of character. Self-conscious men walked like they were performing. This man walked like he was just trying to get to the bar. He sat 2 stools down from Clara without acknowledging her and said, Ruth, coffee if you've got it. Always got it, Ruth said, and poured. The man drank and didn't talk. Ruth went back to her wiping. Clara finished her biscuit and tried to decide what to do with the rest of her afternoon. After perhaps 5 minutes, the man said, not to Clara, not quite to the room, but in a voice that clearly didn't mind being heard, Rough day to arrive in Harlow Creek. Clara looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. I beg your pardon? He glanced at her then. His eyes were gray, or maybe green, hard to say in the low light of the saloon. Word travels fast in a small town. I don't mean any offense. None taken, Clara said, because she was too tired to be indignant. Though I'd appreciate it if word would travel a little more slowly. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. Doesn't work that way out here, so I'm learning. He went back to his coffee. Clara went back to her thinking. The afternoon light was shifting through the window, and she needed to find Millie Pierce's blue door before dark. She was gathering herself to leave when the man said, You looking for work? She went still. What kind of work? He turned on his stool slightly, not facing her fully, but angled enough to indicate that this was now a conversation rather than 2 people talking at the same bar. I run a cattle operation about 12 miles out, Twin Pines Ranch. I've got 8 men and no cook and no one to manage the house. The woman I had left 2 months ago to get married, and I haven't replaced her because I haven't found anyone worth hiring. Clara studied him. What happened to the last one? Besides getting married, nothing happened to her. She was good at the job. I just couldn't compete with a husband. He said this without bitterness, just as a fact. I'm Ethan Cross. Clara Bennett. He nodded as though confirming something he'd already suspected. I'm not offering charity, Miss Bennett. The work is real and it's hard, and some mornings it starts before sunup. I need someone who can cook for 9 men, keep the house from falling apart, and not quit when things get difficult. I pay fare. You'd have your own room and meals included. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Millie Pierce's blue door and $2 a week that she could maybe afford for 1 week, maybe 2, before her money ran out. She thought about the train back to Denver. She thought about Philadelphia and Eleanor's spare room and Eleanor's husband's face. Mr. Cross, she said carefully, I should be honest with you. He waited. I'm a hard worker. I learn quickly, and I'm not afraid of difficulty. She paused. I'm also not an experienced cook. He looked at her. How not experienced? I can make basic things. Eggs, bread, though it doesn't always come out right. Stew, if I have enough time and someone to tell me what I'm doing wrong the first few times. Ruth, at the far end of the bar, made a sound that might have been a smothered laugh. Ethan Cross was quiet. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down and turned it slightly in his hands, looking at it. My last cook, he said finally, Edna Marsh, started the same way. Couldn't boil water without burning the pot. Inside of 4 months, she was making biscuits that grown men would fight over. What was her method? He looked up. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprised, but close. She learned from making mistakes and from asking questions. Then I'll do the same, Clara said. He was quiet again, longer this time. She could feel Ruth pretending not to listen. It's not an easy life, Ethan said. The house is sound, but it's not fancy. The men are rough, but they're decent. Winters here are serious. You understand what that means if you've been in Philadelphia. I understand. And 12 miles is 12 miles. You'd be out there, not in town. If you don't like it after the first week, I'll bring you back myself and pay you for the time. Clara thought about what she had learned in 11 hours on a train from Denver, with everything she'd ever planned folded up neatly and tucked away for a life that no longer existed. She thought about what it had felt like to walk off that platform with her spine straight and her chin up while the whole town watched. She had already done the hardest part, she realized. She had already survived the worst moment of the day. Whatever came next was at least something she was choosing. When do we leave? She said. They left the following morning. Clara spent the night at Millie Pierce's boarding house. Ruth had walked her there herself, which she hadn't asked for but was quietly grateful for, and paid $1 for a single night, which Millie accepted with a great many questions about Clara's origins, her family, her intentions, and the situation at the train platform, which apparently Millie had heard about from 3 separate sources by the time Clara arrived. Clara answered what she chose to answer and deflected the rest with the pleasant vagueness she had developed over years of navigating other people's curiosity. And she went to bed in a narrow room with a slanted ceiling and lay awake for a long time. She did not spend the night thinking about James Aldridge. That surprised her a little later when she reflected on it. She had expected to lie awake replaying the platform, the back of his coat, the young woman's bright laugh. But instead she found herself thinking about what came next, about the ranch 12 miles out, about 8 men she hadn't met, about how to make biscuits that didn't come out like small gray stones, about Ethan Cross's gray-green eyes and the way he had said, I pay fare like it was a point of personal pride. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. In the morning, she retrieved her trunk from the station. It was still there, which she'd half feared it wouldn't be. And she was standing in front of the station at 7 o'clock when Ethan Cross pulled up in a wagon with 2 horses and a load of supplies in the back. He got down and loaded her trunk without asking whether she wanted help, which she appreciated because she didn't particularly need help, but she also didn't need to prove that at 7 in the morning. He gave her a hand up to the bench, again, not making a production of it, just offering, taking her hand and letting her climb. And then he got up on his side and clicked to the horses, and they were moving. For a while, neither of them spoke. The town fell away behind them and the road opened into the wider country. Red rock and scrub grass and the enormous Colorado sky going pale gold at the edges. Clara had a blanket across her lap because the morning was cold in ways that surprised her, and she sat up straight on the bench and watched the land. You sleep all right? Ethan asked after maybe a mile. Well enough. First night in a new place is always the hardest. Is it? I find the second night is worse. The first night you're still running on the day's momentum. The second night, things have had time to settle and you realize where you are. He considered this. Maybe. More silence. Not uncomfortable. That was what Clara noticed. Some silences were like a thing that needed to be filled, that sat between people like an accusation. This one was just quiet. "The men know I'm coming?" she asked. "I told them last night when I got back. Wrote a note for my foreman to post." "How did they take it?" "Hard to say. Hale, that's my foreman, Pete Hale. He'll be polite. He's always polite. Fletcher and Dowd will give you trouble the first week because they give everybody trouble the first week, and then they'll stop. The others will follow whoever sets the tone first." "Who usually sets the tone?" "Whoever's competent." He said it simply, without editorial. "If you can do the job, they'll accept you. If you can't, they won't. There's no diplomacy about it." "That seems fair," Clara said. He glanced at her. "Most women from Philadelphia would find that blunt." "Most women from Philadelphia haven't just been publicly humiliated in front of a train full of strangers," Clara said, and then wished immediately that she hadn't said it, because it was more candor than she'd intended. But Ethan Cross just nodded slowly, as though she'd made a reasonable point. "Fair enough," he said. The road climbed gradually, and the rock walls on either side gave way to open range, and then to stands of pine trees that smelled sharp and cold and alive in the morning air. Clara breathed it in. "Why Twin Pines?" she asked. "There are 2 pine trees at the entrance to the property, tallest trees for 20 miles in any direction. You can't miss them." "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years. He paused. "Started with 200 acres and expanded. It's 1,200 now, about 400 head of cattle." "That's a significant operation." "It takes significant work." She nodded. "And your family?" Something shifted in the air between them, slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a small withdrawal, like a door settling in its frame. "No family," he said. "Not anymore." She didn't press. She had learned over 30 years of living when a subject was finished. They rode in silence for a while longer, and Clara watched the landscape and thought about biscuits and what, specifically, she had gotten herself into. The ranch appeared around a curve in the road, and the first thing she saw was the pine trees. He had not been exaggerating. They were extraordinary. 2 pines rising from either side of the entrance gate, enormous and old and straight, their tops disappearing into the sky. The gate itself was a simple wooden arch with twin pines burned into the crossbar. Beyond it, the road continued for maybe a quarter mile to a cluster of buildings. The main house, a long bunkhouse to one side, a barn, several smaller outbuildings. Mountains in the background, close enough that Clara could see the individual trees on their slopes. "Oh," she said, without intending to. "What?" "It's beautiful." She said it without any particular sentiment, just as an observation of fact. "I hadn't expected that." He looked at the ranch like he was seeing it through her eyes for a moment, which she could tell because his gaze went slightly unfocused, the way people's did when they were looking at something familiar as though for the first time. Then it sharpened again. "The house needs work," he said. "I'll warn you now. The kitchen in particular." "I expected that." "The stove is old. It burns hot on one side and not at all on the other. You'll have to learn its personality." "Stoves have personalities?" "Everything out here has a personality," he said. "You'll see. They came through this gate and down the drive, and by the time the wagon stopped in front of the main house, several of the men had appeared. Clara registered them quickly. 5 visible, probably 3 or 4 more somewhere. A mixed group, various ages and builds, all wearing the particular expression of men trying to assess something new while pretending not to. The foreman, Pete Hale, she would learn, a compact man of about 50 with a neat gray mustache, came forward and touched his hat. "Miss Bennett, welcome to Twin Pines." "Mr. Hale," she said. "Thank you." Behind him, a younger man with a red bandana and an openly suspicious expression, that would be Fletcher, looked her up and down and then said to Ethan, "She cooked before." "She's learning," Ethan said, which was technically true and more charitable than what Clara had actually told him. Fletcher's expression did not improve. "I'll need someone to show me where things are in the kitchen," Clara said to no one in particular, "and I'll need to know what time meals are expected, and I'd appreciate someone telling me what the men particularly dislike eating so I know what to avoid." There was a short silence. Pete Hale said, "I can show you the kitchen, Miss Bennett." "Dowd hates anything with fish," said a younger man near the back earnestly. "He'll complain about it for days." Then we won't do fish, Clara said. What else? Several of them spoke at once. She listened and filed it away, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance because she needed to start, as she meant to go on. The kitchen was worse than expected, not uninhabitably so, but the stove was indeed a study in uneven temperament, and the pantry held a collection of supplies that had clearly been organized by someone who no longer worked there, and then allowed to drift into disorder by people who didn't particularly care where things were, as long as they existed somewhere. There was flour and cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans and onions and several tins of things Clara couldn't immediately identify. There was a barrel of apples that were past their best. There were potatoes, plentiful, which was a mercy. Pete Hale stood in the doorway while Clara moved through the kitchen, opening cupboards, poking at sacks, reading labels. He seemed uncertain whether to offer to help or leave her to it. "How many meals a day?" Clara asked. "Breakfast at 5:30. Dinner at midday if they're near the house. Supper at 6. And they come in from the range for midday?" "Not always. Some days they take food out with them. Depends on what's being done. So I should plan for midday here and have something ready to send out on the days they aren't." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to face him. He was a careful man, she could see, the kind who watched more than he talked, who had probably been watching her since the wagon pulled up. "Mr. Hale, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." He nodded. "Is there anything I need to know about this situation that Mr. Cross didn't tell me? Any particular difficulty I should be prepared for?" He thought about that for a moment. Fletcher's going to be a problem. He was hoping Mr. Cross would hire on his cousin's wife, and when he didn't, he came back sour. "I suspected as much. He's not mean, he's just stubborn, and he voices it." "I can work with stubborn. Anything else?" Hale was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Cross is a good man, but he keeps to himself. He lost someone a few years back. His wife. Since then he runs the ranch, and he does it well. But he doesn't—" Hale seemed to be choosing words carefully. "He doesn't let people too close. It's not unfriendliness, it's habit." "I appreciate you telling me that. I'm not telling you because I think—" He stopped, seemed vaguely embarrassed. "I'm telling you so you don't take it personally if he seems distant." "Understood," Clara said. "And I'm not here looking for closeness, Mr. Hale. I'm here to do a job." He nodded, with the particular nod of someone who believed her and also wasn't entirely sure she understood yet all the ways the situation might complicate that intention. Clara turned back to the pantry and began taking inventory in earnest. "Yes, that's right." The first night's supper was beans and cornbread and roasted potatoes. It was not inspired cooking. The cornbread was slightly too dense and the beans could have used another hour, but the potatoes were good. She had learned that much living on her own in Philadelphia, that if you roasted potatoes in enough fat with salt and left them alone long enough, they came out right. And there was enough of everything that no one went hungry. She brought it out herself, loading the table in the main house where the men ate, and she was aware of them watching her in the way they had been watching her all afternoon, the constant low-level assessment of someone new. She didn't perform for it. She just put the food down and said, "Help yourselves. There's coffee on if anyone wants it." Fletcher ate without comment. Dowd ate enthusiastically and asked for more potatoes, which she appreciated. The younger man who had warned her about Dowd's fish aversion, his name was Sam Briggs, 17 years old, barely started shaving, ate everything on his plate and then looked like he wanted to apologize for it, which she found endearing. After supper, while she was cleaning up, Ethan Cross came into the kitchen. He leaned in the doorway, the same way Pete Hale had that afternoon, and she had the impression that the doorway was where people stood in this house when they weren't sure whether they were staying or going. "How was the stove?" "Educational," Clara said. "You were right about its personality. It runs hot on the left side and barely warms the right. I managed tonight, but I'll need to adjust how I use it. I can have someone look at it. It's been needing attention." "I'd appreciate that. Though don't rush on my account. I'll get the hang of it." She was scrubbing the bean pot, which had scorched slightly on the hot side. "The pantry is in fair shape. I'll need some things from town in the next week or two, but not urgently." He nodded. "I'll take you in Thursday, if that works." "Thursday is fine." She set the pot down and dried her hands. "Mr. Cross, I want to say something. He waited. I know today wasn't what you were expecting when you offered me the job. A woman with no cooking experience and a trunk that's too heavy and a very public history that arrived before I did. She kept her voice even. I want you to know that I'm aware of that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I intend to earn what you're paying me. Give me 2 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that she couldn't read. Not unkindness, not skepticism, exactly, but something more private than either. I gave you a week, he said, but 2 is fine. Thank you. He pushed off the doorframe. Kitchen light's good until 10, he said. The lamp in the corner goes out earlier, the wick's bad. I keep meaning to replace it. I'll manage. He nodded, moved to leave. Then, with his back still half turned, the potatoes were good. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, a very small thing. But Clara had been having a day that had required every reserve of dignity and steadiness she possessed, and something about the plainness of the compliment, offered not because he felt he had to, but apparently because he thought it was true, made the back of her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said. He went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the edge of the counter, listening to the sound of the ranch settling into evening, the low sounds of cattle far off, the creak of the bunkhouse, someone outside laughing at something. She thought, all right. She thought, this is where you are now. This is what you have. Make something of it. She picked up the wick lamp, checked what she had left for morning supplies, planned the breakfast in her head, eggs if there were enough, there were, salt pork, the leftover cornbread if it kept overnight, and then she banked the stove carefully, the way she'd been taught years ago by a woman in a boarding house in Philadelphia who hadn't wanted to explain anything but had shown her when she asked. Outside, through the kitchen window, the Colorado sky was going dark and the stars were coming out, more stars than she had ever seen in Philadelphia, more than she'd known existed, spreading across the whole width of the sky like someone had broken something very large and beautiful and just left it there. Clara Bennett looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned down the lamp and went to find her room. The second night was harder, as she'd predicted. She woke in the dark at 3 a.m. and lay still in the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen. Her room, she was already thinking of it that way, though she'd slept in it exactly once. And she let herself for the first time feel the full weight of the last 2 days. James Aldridge, the platform, the young woman in the yellow dress, the way no one had come to help her with her trunk. She let herself be angry about it, which she hadn't done yet. She was fairly good at managing her emotions in public, at keeping things contained and useful, but anger left unacknowledged had a way of curdling into something worse, and she needed it to pass before breakfast. So she lay in the dark and was angry, quietly and thoroughly, and then she let it go. What came after the anger was simpler, not peace exactly. Peace felt like too settled a word for what she had right now, but something like decision. She had made a choice on that platform when she'd picked up her satchel and walked off without looking back. She was still making that choice. Whatever James Aldridge had decided about her, she was not going to let it define what she did next. She got up at 4:30 before the bell and went to the kitchen, and by 5:30 she had eggs scrambled with salt pork and the leftover cornbread warming in the oven and coffee so strong it would wake a man from the bottom of a mine. And when Pete Hale appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:35, he stopped and looked at the table and then looked at Clara and said, "Well?" "Sit down, Mr. Hale," she said. "It's going to be a long day." He sat. The others came in behind him. Sam first, then 2 men she hadn't learned the names of yet, then Dowd, then Fletcher. Fletcher sat down, looked at the eggs, picked up his fork, and ate without speaking. Which was, Clara decided, close enough to acceptance for a Tuesday morning. She poured coffee for everyone and then poured a cup for herself and stood at the edge of the room and looked at the men eating at the table, these rough strangers who were now, in whatever uncertain and complicated sense, her responsibility. And she thought about what Pete Hale had said the previous afternoon. If you can do the job, they'll accept you. She was going to do the job. She was going to learn this stove and this pantry and this ranch, and the particular appetites and complaints of 8 men who hadn't asked for her any more than she'd asked for any of this. She was going to do all of that, starting this morning, 1 meal at a time. Outside, the Colorado sun was just beginning to clear the mountains. Clara Bennett picked up her cup and drank her coffee and thought, "All right, let's begin." The first week nearly broke her. Not in any dramatic way, Spud. There was no single moment of collapse, no tearful scene in the kitchen, no night where she sat down on the floor and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. It was slower than that, and more exhausting. It was the accumulation of small failures, one stacked on top of another, until by Friday evening Clara was moving through the kitchen on something closer to stubbornness than energy, and she knew the difference. Monday's biscuits came out so dense that Sam Briggs, who would eat almost anything without complaint, had quietly set his down after the first bite and looked at the table. Nobody said anything, which was almost worse. Fletcher looked at his biscuit, looked at Clara, looked back at the biscuit, and picked up his coffee instead. She collected the uneaten ones without comment and fed them to the dog that lived under the porch, a large, mournful hound named Buster, who accepted them without judgment, which she appreciated. Tuesday, she overcooked the salt pork at breakfast to the point where it was less pork and more a geological formation, and Dowd, who was generally the most agreeable man at the table, ate his without a word, but chewed it for what seemed like a very long time. That afternoon, she found a handwritten list of recipes in the back of a kitchen drawer, in a looping feminine script she assumed was Edna Marsh's, the previous cook, the one who'd left to get married. She read through it twice and then started at the beginning. Wednesday, she got the biscuits right. Not perfectly right. They were a little pale on top because she'd misjudged the stove's uneven heat, but they were light inside, properly risen, and tasted the way biscuits were supposed to taste. She put them on the table for supper and watched without being obvious about it. Dowd took two and then reached for a third. Sam ate his in about 45 seconds. Even Fletcher took a second one, though he did it quickly and without looking up, as though he didn't want to be caught at it. Pete Hale, at the end of the table, caught her eye across the room. He didn't smile, but he raised his coffee cup toward her by about an inch, and she took that for what it was. Still, the days were long in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not just in hours, though the hours were genuinely long, up before 5, rarely finished in the kitchen before 8 at night, but in the texture of the work itself. There was always something that needed doing the moment something else was done. Dishes led to prep for the next meal. The kitchen floor, swept in the morning, needed sweeping again by afternoon because men came in and out tracking mud and hay. The firewood box next to the stove needed filling constantly, which meant asking one of the hands to fill it, which in the first week meant navigating who was nearby and willing and whether Fletcher would interpret any request from her as an imposition. Fletcher was, as promised, her primary obstacle. He wasn't cruel. Pete Hale had been right about that. He didn't say anything that crossed a clear line, never raised his voice, didn't do anything that she could take Ethan to directly with a specific complaint. He was instead the kind of difficult that was harder to address. A perpetual low-grade skepticism, expressed in sighs and silences, and the particular way he had of looking at whatever she'd made for supper as though he were doing it a favor by eating it. He told the younger hands, within her hearing, that he'd known a woman back in New Mexico who could cook a steak so well it made a man want to weep, and that some people just didn't have the aptitude for it. Clara did not respond to this. She filed it and moved on. What she could not entirely file and move on from was the cooking itself, which was, she admitted privately and only to herself, considerably more complicated than she had represented to Ethan Cross in that saloon. She had not lied exactly. She had said she wasn't experienced and that she learned quickly, both of which were true. What she had somewhat underrepresented was the gap between knowing the theory of cooking — she had read recipes, she understood the general principles — and doing it in a kitchen where the stove behaved like a difficult personality. The altitude did strange things to how long things took. The only butter she had was salted when a recipe called for unsalted, and she was expected to produce 3 meals a day for 9 men, 7 days a week, with no days off and no one to consult. Edna Marsh's recipe collection became something close to sacred. Clara read it every night before she slept. Not all of it, just the next day's relevant sections, running through the steps in her head the way she used to review lesson plans before school. She made notes in the margins in pencil, small adjustments based on what she was learning about the stove and the pantry. She tried to be scientific about it. Science helped. It wasn't enough by itself, but it helped. The thing that helped more was Sam Briggs. Sam was 17, had been at Twin Pines for 8 months, and had been raised on a farm in Missouri by a grandmother who, by Sam's account, had cooked for 12 people every day of her adult life and had views about it. He had absorbed this information the way children absorb things they're around constantly, not by studying it, but by living inside it. And he was therefore a repository of practical kitchen knowledge without entirely knowing that he was. He started coming into the kitchen about 4 days in, just appearing in the doorway in the late afternoons when the day's work had slowed but supper wasn't ready. Clara noticed that he never came when Fletcher was around, and that he had the slightly guilty air of someone doing something he'd been raised to think of as women's work, and wasn't sure how to account for that. She put him to work immediately. "Sam," she said, the first time he appeared, "come in here and tell me what your grandmother did with dried beans that made them taste like something." He blinked. "Ma'am?" "Dried beans. I've been making them for 3 days and they're edible, but they're not good. I want them to be good." He came in slowly, looked at the pot she had on the stove. "You soak them overnight?" "Yes." "What do you put in the water when they're cooking?" "Salt, pepper." "No onion?" She looked at him. "No." He nodded sagely, in the way of 17-year-olds who are very pleased to know something an adult doesn't. "Grandma always put in an onion, and a piece of salt pork in with them while they cook, not just seasoned at the end. And a bay leaf if you have it." Clara checked the pantry. She had dried onions and salt pork, and in the very back of a high shelf, a small tin of bay leaves she hadn't noticed before. She had beans cooking by 5, with all 3 additions, and when she ladled them out at supper, they were measurably and obviously better. The liquid had gone silky and dark, and the beans themselves had absorbed flavor from the inside rather than just being seasoned on top. Dowd had 2 helpings. After that, Sam appeared in the kitchen almost every afternoon, and Clara let him, and she asked him questions, and he answered them, and she learned things, not from recipes, but from the accumulated domestic knowledge of one Missouri grandmother transmitted through her teenage grandson, that she would not have discovered on her own for months. She learned that sourdough starter, which she found in a crock in the cold pantry, needed to be fed, and that it would die if the kitchen got too cold overnight. She learned the difference between a rolling boil and a simmer, which she had understood in theory but kept conflating in practice because the stove ran so unpredictably. She learned that a cast iron skillet needed to be wiped clean rather than washed because water would strip the seasoning, and that Edna Marsh had apparently been fanatical about this and had left 3 very seasoned skillets that would produce almost nothing sticking results if Clara used them correctly. She also learned that Sam had wanted to be a school teacher before his father's death had ended that particular possibility, that he sent half his wages home to his mother and 2 younger sisters, and that he was reading a book about surveying that he'd found in the bunkhouse, because he'd heard that surveyors made good money in the territories. Clara, who had spent 6 years as a school teacher, found this interesting. "What's stopping you?" she asked him one afternoon while she was making a pie crust, an ambitious undertaking that Edna's notes had warned required cold hands and patience, neither of which came naturally to Clara, but both of which she was developing by necessity. "Stopping me from what?" Sam said. He was peeling apples for the filling, which she'd put him to work on because he had faster hands than she did. "From being a surveyor, or a teacher. From doing something other than ranch work." He was quiet for a moment. "Takes schooling. Takes money to get the schooling." "There are ways to get both," Clara said, "if you're serious about it." He looked at her sideways. "You were a teacher?" 6 years. "In Philadelphia?" "Yes." He peeled another apple, thinking. "What kind of school?" "Primary grades mostly. Some older students in the evenings who were working during the day and studying when they could." She pressed the crust into the pan, feeling the fat start to soften under her warm hands, which was exactly what Edna's notes had warned against. She worked faster. "It's a reasonable life, teaching, not a wealthy one." "Beats being cold 8 months of the year," Sam said. Clara, who was not cold in the kitchen, but had gathered enough about Colorado winters to know what he meant, said, "Yes, I'd imagine it does." She liked Sam Briggs. She didn't tell him that because he would have found it embarrassing and because it wasn't exactly the point, but she liked him. He reminded her of the better students she'd had in Philadelphia, the ones who were hungry for things without knowing yet how to name what they were hungry for. The pie came out well. The crust was a little thick on the edges, but the apples inside were soft and cinnamon sweet, and when she put it on the table after supper on Thursday night, There was a moment of genuine surprise from the men, who had apparently not been expecting a dessert. Fletcher ate 2 pieces. He still didn't say anything complimentary, but he ate 2 pieces, and Clara, observing this, thought, progress. But good. Ethan Cross, meanwhile, was present in the way that the weather was present, a constant factor in the environment that affected everything without always making itself obvious. He ate with the men at supper most nights, sitting at the head of the table, and he ran the meal the way Clara gathered he ran everything, without ceremony, efficiently, occasionally interjecting with something practical about the next day's work. He was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, and the men seemed comfortable with this. The supper table was usually lively without him needing to animate it, and he sat at the head of it in a way that was clearly but not oppressively the head. He came into the kitchen every few days, always in the evenings after supper when Clara was cleaning up, always with something specific, a question about supplies, a report that the stove repair had been scheduled, a note that a shipment was coming in from town that would include provisions she'd asked for. He was never there without a reason, and he never stayed long. She noticed that he noticed things, though. He didn't comment on the pie the night she made it, but 2 days later he asked, casually, whether she'd used the apples from the cold cellar or the fresh ones Pete had brought from town. When she said the cold cellar ones, he said they were better for cooking because they'd lost some of their water. She hadn't known that. She filed it. Another evening he came in while she was fighting with the sourdough starter, which had developed a smell that she wasn't sure about, slightly sharper than it had been, with a grayish liquid sitting on top. "Something's wrong with this," she said, before he'd said anything. He came to look over her shoulder, and she was aware of how close he was. Not inappropriately, just the proximity of 2 people looking at the same thing. And he smelled like horse and cold air, and something faintly like cedar, which she assumed was whatever he used for soap. "That's just the hooch," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "The gray liquid. Edna called it hooch. It just means the starter is hungry. You pour it off and feed it." He stepped back. "Edna kept a note about it somewhere." "I found the note," Clara said. "I wasn't sure if it was salvageable." "It's salvageable." He paused. "Edna kept that starter going for 4 years. She'd have words for anyone who let it die." "Where is she now, Edna?" "Grand Junction. Her husband's a mine foreman." Something in his voice was neutral, but not uncaring. "She sends a letter at Christmas." Clara poured off the liquid and fed the starter, the way the note had described. "You must miss her cooking." "I miss the competence," he said. Then, as though that had come out more bluntly than he'd intended, "She knew this kitchen, took the guesswork out of it." "That's what I'm working toward," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I can see that." She waited, but he didn't add anything further. He lingered for another moment. Could feel it, that brief pause before departure, like he'd thought of something else and then decided against it. And then he was gone, and she was alone with the starter and the sound of the wind picking up outside. She didn't think about the cedar soap smell, or rather, she noticed herself not thinking about it, which was a different thing, and she set it aside with the focus of a woman who had enough actual problems to deal with. The second week was better. Not easier. There's a difference, but better, in the specific sense that she made fewer mistakes and recovered faster from the ones she did make. She developed a rhythm with the stove. She learned to think of it not as a reliable appliance, but as an unreliable collaborator, something that required understanding and management rather than just use. She learned which side to use for slow cooking and which for fast, and she learned to rotate things, pots, pans, the bread tin, to compensate for the uneven heat. It was inefficient, and she was still working on getting the repairman out to look at it, but she managed. She learned the men's particular habits at table, which was its own kind of knowledge. Dowd was enthusiastic about everything and would eat seconds of almost anything, which was easy. Sam was appreciative but not demonstrative. 2 men named Garrett and Webb were quiet eaters who got on with it and didn't complain, which she respected. A man named Oscar Pruitt was older, maybe 60, and had spent 40 years on ranches and eaten cooking that ranged from very good to nearly inedible, and he evaluated Clara's meals with the level interest of a man who had seen it all and was content to wait and see. Fletcher was still Fletcher. But something shifted in the middle of the second week that Clara hadn't anticipated, and it came from an unexpected direction. She had gone out to the cold cellar on a Tuesday afternoon to pull some provisions. It was a stone-walled cellar dug into the hillside behind the house, cool even in the summer, where the longer storage items were kept. She was reaching for a crock of preserved pears on a high shelf when the shelf bracket gave without warning. The crock came down. She caught it before it hit the ground, but the bracket itself knocked the lamp she'd set on a lower shelf, and it went over, and the kerosene went across the floor. The flame caught in about 2 seconds. Clara had the presence of mind immediately to set the crock down safely before doing anything else. There was some portion of her brain that registered glass and preserved fruit hitting a stone floor as a complication she didn't need. And then she pulled off her apron and smothered the fire with it. It was not a large fire. The floor was stone. The shelves were old and dry, but not immediately adjacent to where the kerosene had spread, and she got it out inside of a minute. She stood in the dark cellar, apron in her hands, smelling kerosene and singed cloth, and took stock. The shelves were fine. The crock was fine. She was fine. The apron was mostly fine except for a brown scorch mark along the bottom that would not wash out. Then she became aware that she was shaking. Not badly. Just a fine tremor in her hands and a hollow feeling in her chest that she recognized as the body's afterthought about danger. She sat down on the cellar steps and let it pass, breathing steadily through her nose the way she'd taught herself years ago. After a minute, she heard footsteps above, and then Fletcher's voice at the cellar door. "Miss Bennett, I saw smoke." "Everything's fine," she called up. "A lamp tipped. I've handled it." A pause. "You sure?" "Quite sure, thank you." She heard him move away, and she sat there for another 30 seconds, and then she got up, retrieved what she'd come for, and went back to the kitchen. She thought nothing more about it until the next morning, when she came downstairs at 4:30 to find a new lamp, a better one than the one she'd broken, with a wider base and a proper handle, sitting on the kitchen table with a folded piece of paper under it that said, in cramped, laboriously printed handwriting, "Cellar lamp, sturdier, F." She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her basket for the cellar, washed her hands, and started the coffee. Fletcher came in for breakfast at his usual time and sat in his usual place and said nothing. But he ate his eggs without the studied reluctance he'd been performing for 2 weeks, and when she refilled his coffee, he said, "Thanks," in a tone that, while not warm, was at least genuine. It wasn't a transformation. Clara was not naive enough to mistake a new lamp for friendship or forgiveness for his original objection to her being here. But it was something, the small gesture of a stubborn man acknowledging, privately and obliquely, that she had handled something well. She could work with that. On Thursday of the second week, as promised, Ethan took her into Harlow Creek for supplies. The wagon ride was 12 miles each way, and Clara had grown accustomed by now to the particular quality of silence that characterized riding with Ethan Cross. Not uncomfortable, not conversational, somewhere between the two. He drove, and she sat with her list on her lap, and they went through the first several miles without talking, which suited her. Then, unexpectedly, "How are you finding it?" She looked at him. He was watching the road. "The ranch? The work? The men?" A brief pause. "Everything." She considered the honest answer, which was complicated, versus the diplomatic answer, which was incomplete. "It's harder than I expected," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm getting the measure of it." "Fletcher giving you trouble?" "Fletcher is adjusting," she said. "He'll come around." Ethan's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "He left a lamp in the kitchen." "He did." "That's Fletcher's version of an apology." I gathered. She looked out at the road ahead. "He's not wrong to have been skeptical. I wasn't the most qualified candidate." "You were the only candidate," Ethan said. "At short notice. That's a low bar." "Maybe. But you cleared it." It was said without flattery, just as an assessment, the way he said most things. She had learned to take his directness at face value, which was its own kind of relief after years of navigating the complicated social grammar of Philadelphia, where what people said and what they meant were frequently two different things. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why did you offer me the job?" "On the platform. You'd known me for 5 minutes. You knew nothing about me except that I'd just been publicly humiliated and that I couldn't cook." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the feeling he was deciding whether to answer properly or to deflect. "You walked off that platform like you had somewhere to be," he said finally. "When you clearly didn't." She blinked. "That's all?" "That, And you answered my question honestly about not being able to cook. He glanced at her sideways. Most people would have lied, told me they could cook, figured they'd manage somehow. You didn't. I figured if you were honest about a thing that made you look bad, you'd be honest about other things too. Clara thought about this for a moment. That's a fairly slim basis for a hiring decision. It's worked better than most of my other hiring decisions, he said. I hired a man on the strength of a handshake once. He stole 2 horses and a bag of seed corn. At least I haven't stolen the horses, Clara said. Give it time, he said, and something in his voice had shifted, and she realized it was almost a joke. Almost. He had the manner of a man who had once known how to be easy company and had gotten out of the habit, and the remnants of it surfaced occasionally like furniture glimpsed underwater. The shape still recognizable, just not currently usable. She smiled, not at him, just at the road ahead, and he didn't see it or pretended not to. In Harlow Creek, she did her shopping efficiently. The dry goods store, the butcher, a stop at the hardware store for some things the kitchen needed. She was aware, moving through the town, of the occasional glance from people who recognized her from the platform, who had filed her in that particular social archive of notable events. She met these glances evenly and moved on. She had no energy for other people's narrative about her. At the dry goods store, she ran into the young woman in the yellow dress. Not James Aldridge. She didn't see him, didn't look for him. But the woman was there with a basket on her arm, and she saw Clara at almost the same moment Clara saw her, and for a beat they were simply 2 women standing in a general store with the particular uncomfortable knowledge between them of what had connected their lives. The woman looked mortified. Clara had not expected that. Miss Bennett, the young woman said. Her name, Clara would later learn, was Dolly Marsh, no relation to Edna, and she was 20 years old and had been corresponding with James Aldridge for 6 months, which overlapped considerably with the period during which he had been corresponding with Clara. She clearly knew this, and was clearly not sure what to do with it. Clara looked at her for a moment. No need, Clara said. I want you to know I didn't know about... It's truly all right, Clara said, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she more or less meant it. Whatever she'd spent that first night feeling, it had largely resolved itself. She had no quarrel with Dolly Marsh. The quarrel, such as it was, belonged to a man who was no longer her concern. I hope you'll be happy, Clara said, and she meant that too, in an impersonal sort of way, and then she went back to looking at flower prices because she had a list to get through. She was aware, walking back to the wagon with her supplies, that something had settled in her chest. Not fully. She suspected some portion of the humiliation of that first day would take considerably longer to finish doing whatever it was doing, but enough. Enough to walk past the station without looking at it. Enough to climb up onto the wagon seat and check her list and say, I think I have everything, unless you need anything from the hardware store. Already done, Ethan said. Then we can go. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled out of Harlow Creek, and Clara did not look back. The day that changed things with the men happened at the end of the second week, on a Friday afternoon that had started cold and gotten colder. She had been making stew, a large batch, enough for supper and leftovers, and she had the kitchen warm enough to be comfortable in a light shawl when she heard the commotion in the yard. Not an emergency sound, but voices raised and the particular cadence of something unexpected. She went to the kitchen door. 3 of the men were gathered in the yard near the barn. Oscar Pruitt and Webb and Garrett, all looking at something on the ground that resolved, as she got closer, into Sam Briggs, sitting with his back against the barn wall and his right arm held stiff against his chest. His face was white. Not pale. White. The whiteness of real pain. What happened? She said. Horse spooked, Oscar said. Clipped him. His wrist, we think. He's not wanting to show it. She crouched in front of Sam. Let me see. It's fine, Sam said through his teeth. He was 17 and it was obviously not fine. Sam, let me see. He unclenched his arm from his chest, slowly. The wrist was already swelling, the skin going purple at the joint. Clara looked at it without touching it first, then placed 2 fingers very lightly along the swollen area and asked Sam to tell her if anything was worse than the general bad. He winced twice, once over the joint itself, once slightly further down. She had no medical training. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself. She had grown up in a house where her mother had dealt with minor injuries. She'd set a dislocated finger once, wrapped a sprained ankle more times than she could count, and she had read, because she read most things, a medical household guide that had been in the boarding house in Philadelphia. None of this made her a doctor, but the nearest doctor was in Denton, which was 30 miles away, and the road to Denton in this weather was not a comfortable ride, and Sam's color was not improving. "It's not broken," she said, with more certainty than she entirely felt. "I think it's a bad sprain, possibly a small fracture at the edge here, but the joint itself is intact." She looked at Sam. "Can you move your fingers?" Slowly, with effort, he moved them. All of them. "Good," she said. "That's good. I need cold water and clean cloth and something I can use to splint this temporarily." Oscar was already moving before she'd finished the sentence. She splinted the wrist herself, there in the yard, with cold compresses first for the swelling, and then a splint fashioned from 2 narrow pieces of wood Pete Hale found in the barn, bound firmly but not too tightly with strips of clean sheeting she'd sent Garrett to get from the house. Sam did not complain once, which made it easier, and she talked him through each step without asking him how he felt because she could see how he felt, and asking wouldn't help. When it was done, she said, "Someone needs to take him to Denton tomorrow morning. That wrist needs a proper examination." "I'll go," Oscar said immediately. "Pete should know tonight." She looked at Sam. "You're going to be in some pain this evening. Don't try to work through it. If it gets worse, if you feel anything besides the wrist, you come and get me immediately." Sam nodded. His color was coming back a little now that the wrist was supported. "Thank you, Miss Bennett." "Don't thank me. I probably should have done this faster." She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "The stew's going to need watching. One of you up. "I'll watch the stew," Garrett said. She looked at him. He was a man of maybe 30 who hadn't said more than 20 words to her in 2 weeks. He held her gaze steadily. "Don't let it boil," she said. "If it starts to bubble hard, move it to the right side of the stove." "Yes, ma'am." She went back to the kitchen, washed her hands, and let herself sit down for approximately 2 minutes before she started on the bread. At supper that evening, something was different at the table. She couldn't have identified it precisely. Nothing dramatic, no speech, no ceremony. But it was there in the way the men looked at her, and the way they passed things, and the way conversation included her rather than simply occurring in her presence. Oscar made a point of telling Pete, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that Clara had splinted the wrist clean and sure, and that the doctor in Denton had confirmed the next day that she'd done it right. She was cutting bread at the counter when Fletcher said, from his end of the table, "Miss Bennett, you ever think about becoming a doctor?" She looked at him. It was the most words he had directed at her that weren't logistical. "The idea had not occurred to me," she said. "Might be a waste," Fletcher said. He went back to his stew. Then, "This is the best batch of stew you've made." The table was quiet for 1 second. Then Dowd said, "It really is." And several of the others agreed, and Clara turned back to her bread so no one would see her expression, which had done something she hadn't planned for, and that she needed a moment to manage before she could face the room again. She had not expected it to matter so much. She had told herself she was here to do a job, and that approval was not the measure of the work. That was true. She believed it. But there was a difference between not needing approval and not wanting it, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. She stood at the counter and pressed the heel of her hand into the bread dough and thought, "Keep going, just keep going." That night, later than she usually stayed up, she was still in the kitchen when Ethan came through on his way from the study to the back door, a route he took sometimes when he wanted air she'd noticed. He stopped when he saw the light still on. "Still up?" "I was writing down some things while I remembered them," she said. She had Edna's recipe book open, and she was adding notes in her own handwriting in the margins. Not just cooking adjustments anymore, but observations, things that worked, things that didn't. The pages were getting crowded. "I'll be done in a minute." He looked at the book over her shoulder briefly. "You've been adding to it. Edna won't mind, I hope. It's just notes." "Edna would probably be pleased," he said. "She always said that book was for whoever needed it next." Clara nodded. She capped the ink and closed the book. "Mr. Cross, Sam is going to need time off the wrist, 3 weeks minimum, before he should be doing heavy work." "I know. Oscar told me. I'll adjust the work assignments. He's also," she hesitated, "he's a smart boy, genuinely so." He's wasted doing fence work. Ethan looked at her. He's a ranch hand. He's a ranch hand for now because that's what's available, Clara said. But he reads. He's teaching himself surveying from a book he found in the bunkhouse. He's the kind of person who goes further if someone points in a direction. She paused. I just thought you might want to know that. He was quiet for a moment. What do you suggest? I don't know your operation well enough to suggest specifics, but there might be work that uses his mind as well as his back, if you're inclined to look for it. Another pause. Longer. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not exactly surprised, but something adjacent to it, as though she'd said something that reorganized the furniture of a familiar room. I'll think on it, he said. That's all I'm asking. He nodded, started to go. Then, at the doorway, as though it had just occurred to him, what you did today with Sam, that was good. I got lucky, she said. He wasn't seriously hurt. You made it less serious, Ethan said. That's not luck, that's paying attention. He went out. The door settled in its frame with the soft click she'd gotten used to. Clara sat in the kitchen with the recipe book and the dying fire in the stove and the sound of the Colorado wind moving around the corners of the house. And she thought about 2 weeks ago on a train platform with a worn trunk at her feet and no plan and $17.40. She thought about how far that felt from here. Not far in time. 14 days, 15 counting today. But far in whatever the actual unit was for the distance between despair and something else. Something that wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but that was at least pointing in hope's direction. She was tired. Her hands were dry from the dishwater and her back ached from being on her feet since before dawn, and she still hadn't figured out a reliable method for the sourdough that didn't require monitoring it every 4 hours. But she was here. She was doing the work. And slowly, imperfectly, with about as much grace as the biscuits she'd produced in the first few days, she was building something. She banked the stove and took the lamp to her room. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant a larger breakfast because the men weren't going out early, which meant she needed to be up by 4. She set the thought of it in her mind like a stone she'd pick up on the way out. Practical, necessary, sufficient for tonight. She lay down and was asleep almost before she'd finished the thought. 3 weeks after Clara Bennett had arrived at Twin Pines with a trunk too heavy to carry and a cooking repertoire that barely qualified as one, she made her first genuinely good pot of soup. Not good in the way that things are good when you're hungry and grateful for anything. Good in the way that makes people slow down when they're eating. Good in the way that produces a particular silence at the table that is not the absence of conversation, but the presence of something better. Chicken broth with root vegetables and dumplings that had come out light for the first time, floating in the liquid like small clouds. She had made the broth from the bones of 2 chickens she'd roasted the day before, simmering them overnight the way Edna's notes had described, and the result was a depth of flavor she hadn't managed to produce before. Something that tasted like it had taken time, because it had. Oscar Pruitt had a second bowl without being asked if he wanted one, which for Oscar was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Sam, whose wrist was healing well, though he was still splinted and still prohibited from heavy work, ate his left-handed and declared it the best thing he'd had since his grandmother's kitchen in Missouri, which was, Clara had come to understand, the highest compliment in his personal vocabulary. Even Fletcher, who had been thawing steadily since the lamp incident, though he'd never admit the thaw was deliberate, scraped the bottom of his bowl and then looked at the pot on the counter with the expression of a man calculating his odds of getting a third helping without anyone noticing. There's more, Clara said, without turning around from the counter where she was washing the bread pan. She heard his chair push back. What she had not expected in the weeks since arriving was how much she would come to understand these men without meaning to. Not their private histories, so most of them kept those guarded, the way men in hard work tended to, as though softness was a thing that needed protecting behind toughness, but their daily selves. The way Dowd always came to breakfast 5 minutes before anyone else, and stood outside the kitchen door rather than knocking, out of some private notion of politeness. The way Garrett hummed something tuneless when he was doing repetitive work, always the same wordless melody, and stopped the moment he noticed anyone listening. The way Pete Hale took the same route across the yard every morning, regardless of the weather, a worn path in the dirt that traced his 30 years of habit. She had not expected to care about any of it, but she found, to her own mild surprise, that she did. It was Sam who first told her what the men were saying about her, not in a way that was calculated to flatter her. Sam wasn't built for calculation. It was one of his better qualities, but in the straightforward way of someone reporting information that he thought was relevant. They were in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, the fourth week now. Sam was doing the things he could do one-handed, peeling, stirring, carrying light items, and Clara was working on a recipe for dried apple cake that Edna's notes had flagged as a particular favorite of the men during winter months. She was trying to get ahead of the season, though it was still summer, because she had learned by now that at Twin Pines it was always worth getting ahead of things. "Fletcher told Oscar you were better than he expected," Sam said. He was peeling potatoes, and he said it the way he said most things, looking at what he was doing, not at her. "Did he?" Clara said. "Said most people in your situation would have quit in the first week." "What situation is that?" Sam thought about it. "Coming from nothing, I think he meant. Having to learn everything from scratch. He said most people can't do that without—" He paused. "He said a lot of people can't stand being bad at things long enough to get good at them." Clara was quiet for a moment. She measured out the dried apple, thinking about that. "Fletcher has a higher opinion of people than he lets on," she said. "Don't tell him that. He'd be horrified." She smiled at the apple in the measuring cup rather than at Sam, but she thought he caught it anyway. "Oscar also said something," Sam continued, in the tone of someone who has two pieces of news and is delivering them sequentially. "Am I going to want to hear it?" "He said—" Sam stopped peeling for a second. "He said you reminded him of his wife before she passed." He resumed peeling quickly, as though the statement required movement to follow it. "He doesn't talk about her. Just thought you should know he said it." Clara set down the measuring cup. Oscar Pruitt was 61 years old and had the self-containment of a man who had outlived the things that mattered most to him and had made his peace with it, or was in the process of making his peace with it, which was probably closer to accurate. He was kind in the way of people who have been through something and decided that kindness was the right response. She had not known about his wife. She picked up the measuring cup again. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I figured you'd want to know," Sam said. "That people see you. Not just, the cook." Clara mixed the dried apple into the batter and did not say anything for a moment because she didn't quite trust what she would say if she tried. Then she said evenly, "How's the wrist?" "Better. Doc said maybe another 10 days. "Good." She poured the batter into the pan. "When it's healed, I want to start going through that surveying book with you, the mathematics of it." He looked up then, startled. "You know surveying mathematics?" "No," she said, "but I know general mathematics well enough to follow it, and two people working through something understand it better than one, if you're serious about it." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "I'm serious about it." "Good," she said again. "Then we'll start." She slid the pan into the oven, and the kitchen settled back into the comfortable quiet of two people working alongside each other, and outside the Colorado afternoon was going golden on the red rock walls. And Clara thought, this is what I came for. Not the man on the platform, not the plan I had. This. She wasn't entirely sure she believed that yet, but she was working toward it. The accident happened on a Saturday in late August, in the kind of heat that arrived in the late mornings and sat on the land like a physical weight. Clara had been up since before 4, as usual, and had gotten through breakfast and was working on the midday meal when she heard the sound from the eastern pasture. A shout, and then several voices. And then the particular quality of noise that meant something had gone wrong in a way that wasn't small. She went out to the yard. Pete Hale was already crossing at a near run, and behind him 2 men she didn't know by name were carrying someone, between them, and her first thought was not Sam, and then she saw that it wasn't Sam. It was Dowd, and he was conscious but barely, his face the same gray-white she'd seen on Sam's face a month ago, except far worse, and the left side of his shirt was dark and wet. What happened? She was already moving toward them. "Fence wire," Pete said tightly. "Cable broke. Hit him across the chest and abdomen. We've got pressure on it, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. They carried Dowd to the bunkhouse and laid him on the nearest bed, and when they moved the makeshift pressure bandage, Clara looked at what was underneath and understood immediately why Pete hadn't finished his sentence. The wire had struck diagonally across Dowd's left side, from just below his shoulder, across his ribs, down to his lower abdomen. The cuts were multiple and varied in depth. Some were superficial, already clotting. One, along the rib line, was not. "Has anyone gone for Ethan?" she said. "Garrett's gone," Pete said. "Is anyone riding to Denton?" "It's 3 hours, Miss Bennett, at least. Maybe more in this heat." She looked at the wound. She looked at Dowd's face, which was aware but only just. He was watching her with the particular look of a man who has been hurt badly enough to know he's been hurt badly, who is not panicking only because panic would take energy he doesn't have. His breathing was shallow and too fast. "Dowd," she said, and he looked at her more clearly. "I'm going to help you. I need you to stay as still as you can, and I need you to try to breathe slowly if you can manage it." "Yes, ma'am," he said, in almost no voice. She sent Pete for everything she needed, and Pete went without questioning, which told her something about how bad it looked. She needed hot water, clean cloth, the cleanest available, boiled if possible, and if not, then the best they had. Whiskey, not for Dowd to drink, but for cleaning. Needle and thread if there was any, and she knew there was because she'd found a sewing kit in the house and moved it to the kitchen shelf where she could find it. She needed someone to hold the lamp because the bunkhouse light was wrong. She needed everyone who wasn't helping to get out. Fletcher, who had come in with the others, herded the unnecessary people out without being asked. Clara noted this and moved on. She had never sutured a wound. She needed to be clear about that with herself even as she prepared to do it, because self-deception in this particular moment would be genuinely dangerous. She had read descriptions of the procedure, the household medical guide again, which she was beginning to think had been the most useful book of her adult life. And she had a basic understanding of the principle: close the wound, limit blood loss, prevent contamination as much as possible, get the man to a doctor as soon as humanly feasible. But she was here and the doctor was 3 hours away, and the wound along Dowd's ribs was not going to wait 3 hours. "Pete," she said, "I need you to hold the pressure here while I prepare." She placed his hand on the folded cloth over the worst of the cut. "Firm, don't let up." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and his voice was steady, which helped. She threaded the needle by the lamplight, and her hands were, she checked them deliberately, not shaking. She did not know what to make of that. It might have been steadiness, or it might have been the particular calm that came when a situation was serious enough to suppress the luxury of fear, and she didn't have time to analyze the distinction. She cleaned around the wound first. The superficial cut she dressed and bound. The deeper laceration along the rib she examined as carefully as she could, touching the edges gently, watching Dowd's face for changes in his pain. And there was something that might have been a cracked rib underneath, she couldn't be sure. But the cut itself didn't have the look of something that had gone deeper than it should. The bleeding was serious, but it wasn't arterial, and she had read enough to know the difference. She was working when Ethan came in. She heard him behind her guts, the sound of boots, the particular quality of his movement, which she had learned to recognize, and she did not turn around. "How bad?" he said. "Significant," she said. "Rib laceration, deep. Several smaller cuts, dressed. I'm closing the rib wound now. He needs a doctor, but I don't think it can wait for Denton." A pause. "What do you need from me?" "Steady the lamp. Pete's hands are occupied." He took the lamp from the man holding it and held it exactly right, angled so the light fell where she was working, steady as stone. She did not thank him because she didn't have the attention to spare for it, but she registered it. She sutured the wound. She would not describe it as anything other than what it was, which was an imprecise and difficult procedure performed by someone who had never done it before by lamplight in a bunkhouse. And she made 9 stitches where a doctor might have made 12, and they were not uniform. And she was aware throughout of the specific quality of awfulness that came from causing pain to a person in order to help them. Dowd made no sound, which was partly courage, and partly the fact that halfway through, the pain took him under and he went unconscious, which was, Clara decided, probably a mercy. When it was done, she dressed the sutures and bound the whole side firmly, and then sat back on the edge of the bed and looked at her work and at Dowd's face, which was pale but breathing, the respiration still shallow but no worse than before. Pete Hale said quietly, "Miss Bennett." She looked at him. "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "Thank you." "He needs that doctor," she said. "Tonight if possible. We shouldn't move him immediately, but in a few hours carefully." "I'll arrange it," Pete said, and left. She was cleaning up, washing her hands in the basin, collecting the soiled cloths, organizing the remaining supplies so they were easy to find if needed in the night, when she became aware that Ethan was still in the bunkhouse. Everyone else had filed out. He was standing near the door with the lamp he'd been holding, and he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "You've done that before," he said. "No," she said. "I haven't." "It didn't look like a first time." "Well," she said, and wrung out the cloth she'd been using and hung it over the basin edge. "I read a great deal." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular evenness he used when something mattered, "He's going to be all right?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think so. I think what I did was right, but I'm not a doctor and I won't pretend to be one. He needs to be seen, and soon." Ethan nodded. He looked at Dowd's sleeping face, and something moved through his own, something private and brief that he pulled back before it could be read. "He's been with me 8 years, he said. Not to her exactly, just to the air. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her then. "You know?" "He told me. Last week, he was helping me move some supplies and we got to talking." She paused. "He said you were the best boss he'd had. He said that mattered to him." Ethan looked away. He shouldn't have been on that fence line alone. "Don't," Clara said. He looked back, surprised. "Don't do that to yourself right now," she said. "There will be time later to review what happened and adjust things so it doesn't happen again. Right now he needs someone to make sure he gets to Denton safely, and you need to be clear-headed for that. The other thing can wait." Something shifted in his face. Not quite disagreement, not quite acceptance. Something in between. He looked at her the way he had a few times before, in that way that suggested she had said something that moved furniture around in a room he thought he knew well. "All right," he said finally. She picked up her basin and her supplies and walked past him toward the door. "I'll sit with him until the men are ready to move him," she said. "Tell me when." They transported Dowd to Denton that evening, in the wagon with extra blankets and Pete riding alongside. Oscar went too, because Dowd had asked for Oscar with about the last coherence he'd had before going under again, and that was reason enough. Clara sent food for the journey, wrapped bread and cold meat and a jug of water, and a written note of everything she'd done so the doctor in Denton would know what he was working with. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat in the kitchen with the lamp low and Edna's recipe book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. She was thinking about the weight of Dowd's breathing and the particular steadiness that had descended on her while she worked, the way the fear had simply postponed itself and then arrived late, after, when she was wringing out a cloth and suddenly aware that her hands were cold. She had done the best she could. That was the only honest accounting. Whether it was enough was a question that wouldn't be answered until morning at the earliest, and probably not until the men returned from Denton, and she was not a person who could productively sit with open questions, so she eventually stopped trying and made herself a cup of tea and read until she was tired enough to sleep. Ethan found her there around midnight when he came through the kitchen on his way to check the horses, a thing he apparently did when he couldn't sleep, which she gathered from Pete was not uncommon. He stopped when he saw the light. "I was just going to bed," she said. "You don't have to explain," he said. She looked at him. He was in his work clothes still, which meant he also hadn't slept. His hair was disheveled in the way that happened when a man kept running a hand through it, and there were circles under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." "It's midnight. I know what time it is." He sat down. She made coffee, the same strong kind she'd been making since the second week, the kind that Pete Hale had told her was the best coffee the ranch had seen in 2 years, and she set a cup in front of Ethan and sat across the table with her own, and for a while they were both quiet. "Tell me about her," Claire said. He looked up. "Your wife," she said. "Pete told me she passed a few years back. You don't have to talk about it, but you're sitting in my kitchen at midnight and you're not going to sleep, and sometimes it helps to say something out loud." He looked at his coffee cup. He turned it in his hand, say, the same gesture she'd noticed in the saloon in Harlow Creek, the first day, turning the cup while he thought. She wondered if he knew he did it. "Her name was Anne," he said, after a long pause. Clara waited. "She came from Ohio. We met when I was still building this place, before it was anything worth calling a ranch." He was quiet for a moment. She thought it was an adventure. She wasn't wrong, exactly. The first years were rough. She managed them better than I did, if I'm honest. What happened to her? Fever. The winter of '84. He said it without apparent emotion, which she recognized as the sign of grief that had been worked over many times, ground smooth. She was sick for 10 days and then she was gone. It was... He stopped. It was fast, is what I mean. There wasn't time to prepare for it. There never is, Clara said. No. He drank his coffee. After that, I just ran the ranch. That was enough. That was what there was to do. Is it still enough? He looked at her then, and the question sat between them for a moment with all its various implications. She hadn't meant it to carry as much weight as it apparently did, but she watched him register it and decide how to respond, and she saw in his face the careful process of a private man navigating honesty. Some days, he said. She nodded. She hadn't expected more than that. You asked me why I hired you, he said after a moment. On the road to town. You answered, she said. I walked like I had somewhere to be. That was part of it. He was looking at the coffee cup again. The other part was, he seemed to weigh it. Anne walked like that, like the ground was hers to walk on, not just borrowed. He glanced up briefly. I'm not saying that was the reason. I'm saying I noticed it. Clara was quiet. I didn't mean to tell you that, he said. I know, she said, but I'm glad you did. He looked at her, and there was something in the look that was different from the careful assessments she'd grown used to from him. Something less managed, less contained. It lasted only a moment before he put the cup down and pushed back his chair. I'll check the horses, he said. Good night, Mr. Cross. He paused at the door. Ethan, he said. It's midnight. Ethan is fine. She looked at him. Good night, Ethan. He went. The door made its soft sound. Clara sat with her coffee in the kitchen and the low lamp and tried to think about Dowd, which was the practical and necessary thing to think about, and found she was thinking about something else entirely, and then gave herself a stern internal conversation about the difference between appreciation and foolishness, which she believed she understood. She went to bed. The news from Denton arrived mid-morning the next day, carried back by Garrett, who had ridden ahead of the wagon. The doctor had seen Dowd. The sutures had held. The rib was cracked, but not broken through. There was no internal damage that the doctor could identify, which was, he had apparently told Pete Hale, remarkable given the nature of the wound. He had said, Pete's letter reported, Oscar had made Pete write it down, that whoever had done the first treatment had done a competent job, and that the man would need 6 weeks of rest and would have scars, but would recover fully. Garrett read the letter aloud in the yard, where most of the men had gathered when they saw him ride in, and when he got to the part about the competent job, several of them looked at Clara, who was standing at the edge of the group with her arms crossed and her face composed. 6 weeks is a long time short-handed, she said. We'll need to adjust the cooking schedule to account for more men eating at the house rather than going out. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Oscar Pruitt, who had ridden back with the wagon and was still dusty from the road, said quietly, Thank you, Miss Bennett, for what you did. Dowd did the hard part, she said. He held very still. That got a small laugh, which released something in the air, and the men dispersed back to their work, and Clara went back to the kitchen. She was at the stove when she heard someone in the doorway and turned to find it was Sam, wrist still splinted, looking at her with an expression that was more open than his usual careful measure. You're not going to make a thing of it, are you? He said. Make a thing of what? What you did, yesterday. He leaned against the doorframe. A lot of people would. Make sure everyone knew. Everyone already knows, Clara said. I don't need to make a production of it. He nodded slowly. Fletcher said something this morning. Good or bad? He said... Sam almost smiled. He said it was a damn good thing Aldridge was an idiot. Clara turned back to the stove. High praise from Fletcher, she said. Highest I've heard him give anyone. She stirred the pot. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was bright and clear, the red rock walls catching the sun, the 2 pine trees at the entrance gate visible from the kitchen if she stood at the right angle, which she had discovered by accident one morning and had found herself using as a kind of reference point ever since. Those 2 enormous trees, straight and old and unmovable, as though they were holding the gate open by sheer will. She thought about what Sam had said. It was a damn good thing Aldridge was an idiot. She turned it over, examining it. A month ago, on the platform, she would not have framed it that way. She had framed it as catastrophe, as the worst possible outcome of a plan that had been, in retrospect, dangerously optimistic. But standing in this kitchen, with this stove that she had learned the way you learn a difficult person, by patience and attention and a willingness to be frustrated, with those pine trees visible through the window and the sound of the ranch moving around her in all its rough daily motion, she thought, maybe. Maybe it was the best possible outcome of a plan that had been, in retrospect, asking her to settle. She didn't say that to Sam. It was too large a thought for the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, and also she wasn't entirely sure yet that she believed it, and she preferred not to say things she didn't fully believe. But she thought it. Well, the month of September came in cool, the mornings edged with the first suggestion of what winter would eventually mean. Claire had been at Twin Pines for 6 weeks, and the evidence of those weeks was accumulating around her in ways that were both visible and not. The kitchen was hers now in the way that a space becomes yours through constant inhabitation. She knew where everything was without looking, knew the rhythm of the day so well she anticipated the next step before it arrived, knew the sound of each man's boots on the step outside. Dowd came back from Denton at the end of the 3rd week of his recovery, driven in by Pete, and he walked into the kitchen while she was making supper and stood in the doorway, and she thought for one absurd moment that he might actually cry, which would have been complicated for everyone. He didn't. He said, "Miss Bennet," in a very full voice, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and asked if there was any coffee. "Always," she said, and poured him a cup. And that was all the ceremony there was, and it was the right amount. He wasn't cleared for heavy work yet, which meant he spent a lot of time in and around the house, and he took to helping Clara in the afternoons the way Sam had before him. Carrying things, holding things, providing company. Where Sam had given her his grandmother's cooking knowledge, Dowd gave her stories. He was a natural talker when he felt at ease, and he had been many places before Colorado, and he told her about them. New Mexico, Arizona, a year in Texas that he described as the most educational year of his life in ways he declined to specify. He had a gift for description that made the places feel real, and she found that she looked forward to the afternoons more than she'd expected. It was during one of these afternoons, in the 2nd week of September, that Ethan Cross came into the kitchen at a time he didn't usually appear, and she could tell from the way he was standing, slightly more contained than usual, a deliberate quality to his stillness, that something was on his mind. Dowd, reading the same signal, said something about needing to check on the water barrel and took himself out. Clara kept stirring the pot. "What is it?" Ethan came into the kitchen properly and sat at the table, not in the doorway, which was already different from his usual habit. He put his hat on the table in front of him and looked at it. "I got a letter from my brother-in-law," he said. "Anne's brother. In Denver." She waited. "He's got a daughter, 12 years old. Her mother, his wife, died in the spring. He's asking if she could come here for the winter while he settles things." He paused. "He doesn't have anyone else to ask." "And you're wondering whether to say yes," Clara said. "I'm wondering if it's fair to the girl. This is a working ranch, not a—" He seemed to search for the word. "It's rough out here, especially in winter." "How old were you when you started doing rough work?" "That's different." "Is it?" She turned from the stove. "A 12-year-old girl isn't made of glass, Ethan, and rough doesn't have to mean cheerless." She studied him. "You're not worried about whether it's fair to her. You're worried about whether you know how to have a child in the house." He looked at her, not startled exactly, but close. "Yes," he said, after a moment. "You don't," she said plainly. "I imagine you don't. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." She turned back to the stove. "Write and tell him she can come. We'll manage." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We?" Clara realized, a half-beat late, what she'd said. The word had arrived without examination, easy and natural, the way things came out when you weren't guarding against them. "Yes," she said, without turning around. "We." Another silence, different in quality from the ones before. She could feel it, that shift, the way the air in a room changes when something has been said that can't be unsaid and wouldn't be taken back if it could. "All right," Ethan said. His voice was quiet. "All right." She heard the chair push back, the familiar sound of him leaving. But he paused at the kitchen door. She could feel the pause without seeing it, and then he said, "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned. He was looking at her from the doorway, his hat in his hand, with an expression that was more unguarded than she'd ever seen on him. Not quite what she would call vulnerable. That word felt too small for him, too simple. But open. In the way of someone who had been keeping a door shut for a long time and had just, quietly and without fanfare, let it come ajar. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, since the beginning." She held his gaze. "You gave me somewhere to land," she said. "That mattered." He nodded once, and then he was gone, and the kitchen was just a kitchen again, but something in it felt different, warmer, or more settled, or simply more itself than it had been 5 minutes ago, the way places feel when they've been properly inhabited by people who intend to stay. Clara stood at the stove and breathed slowly, and looked at the 2 pine trees through the window, solid in the afternoon light. She thought about James Aldridge on the platform. She thought about the $17.40. She thought about all the plans that had dissolved into the Colorado air and the different life that had materialized in their place, imperfect and hard-won and strange, and, if she was honest with herself, in almost every way that mattered, more hers than anything she'd planned before it. Then the pot boiled over, which it would do when you were being philosophical, and she turned the heat down and went back to work. Nora Cross arrived on the second Thursday of October, on the same afternoon stage that came through Harlow Creek twice a week, and she was smaller than Clara had expected, and more self-contained than any 12-year-old she had ever taught in Philadelphia. She had her mother's coloring, according to Ethan, dark hair, dark eyes, a complexion that in summer would go olive and in the Colorado autumn had gone pale. She carried a single bag that was too big for her to carry comfortably, but that she refused to let anyone take from her, and she looked at Twin Pines when the wagon came through the gate with an expression that was so carefully neutral that Clara immediately understood it as the expression of a child who had decided not to want things she might not get to keep. She had lost her mother in April. She was 12 years old. She had been packed up and sent to live with an uncle she barely knew in a territory she'd never been to. The neutrality was not coldness. It was armor, and Clara recognized it, and she did not try to dismantle it immediately. What she did instead was show Nora to her room. The spare room off the upstairs landing that Ethan had quietly spent a Saturday making livable, adding a second blanket and a small desk that Clara suspected he'd built himself from the wood scraps she'd seen him working with 2 weekends before, and tell her that supper was at 6, that breakfast was at 5:30 if she wanted it, but no one would come and get her, and that if she needed anything, the kitchen was the room at the back of the house, and there was usually someone in it. Then she left the girl alone. Ethan found her in the kitchen that evening, 2 hours before supper, with a look on his face that suggested he'd attempted a conversation with Nora and found the results uncertain. "She barely said 10 words to me," he said. "She said 10 words. Maybe 8. "That's a start," Clara said. "Give her time. She looks like Anne." He said it plainly, the way he said most difficult things, without drama, but with a weight underneath it that he wasn't entirely suppressing. The eyes especially. "Is that hard?" "Some." He sat down at the table. She asked where the horses were. Clara looked at him. "That's not 8 words of nothing. That's a 12-year-old who is interested in horses and is trying to find an entry point." He processed this. "I showed her the barn after." "Good. She knows horses. Better than I expected. She was asking about Garrett's gray mare by name. She must have read the name off the stall board, and she wanted to know its age and whether it was fast." "And is it?" "Fast enough." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the direction of one. "She said her mother had a bay horse in Ohio." "There it is," Claire said. He looked at her. "There what is?" "The way in." She turned back to the stove. "She's not going to talk about her mother. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But she'll talk about the horse because the horse is something she can hold on to. Start there." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before. With children." 6 years, she said. "Primary grades. You learn to find the side door." "The side door. Children don't walk through the front when they're hurt. You have to find where they've left a window cracked and work from there." She adjusted the heat on the stove. She'll come around. She just needs to see that this place won't disappear on her. What Clara didn't say, because it would have been too direct for where they were, was that she understood Nora Cross in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with professional experience. She had been that child once, the one who had decided not to want things, who wore her careful neutrality like weather gear because the alternative was being exposed. Loss did that. It taught you to hold your expectations at arm's length, to evaluate before you committed, to protect the interior self from the full force of something that might be taken away. She understood it. She was also, she recognized, still doing some version of it herself. The thought was uncomfortable enough that she redirected it toward supper. Nora appeared at the breakfast table the next morning at 5:15, 15 minutes before the men, and she sat in the chair nearest the kitchen door and watched Clara work without speaking. Clara gave her coffee, which she accepted with slight surprise. Apparently her father didn't allow it. And a piece of bread with butter, and she ate and watched and didn't ask questions. The questions came 3 days later, when she had apparently decided Clara was safe enough to ask them. "How do you know what goes with what?" she said. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and Clara was working out what to do with the venison Pete had brought in that morning, which was a cut of meat she hadn't cooked before, but that Edna's notes addressed in some detail. "With food?" Clara said. "With any of it. How do you know how much salt or how long to cook something?" "I read a great deal," Clara said, "and I ask questions, and I make mistakes and figure out what went wrong." Nora considered this. "You didn't always know how to do this?" 2 months ago, I could barely make biscuits that didn't bounce." The girl almost smiled. Almost. "What changed?" "Practice," Clara said, "and having someone to ask." She looked at Nora. "Your grandmother taught your father, didn't she?" "Anne's mother." A brief stillness, then, "A little. Mom made good apple cake." "I can teach you that if you want. I have the recipe." Nora looked at the table, then back at Clara. "Maybe," she said. Which was, Clara had learned, Nora's version of yes. By the end of October, Nora was in the kitchen every afternoon that she wasn't in the barn, which was most afternoons. She was quick to learn, quick to see what needed doing, quick to calculate. And she had a palate that was unexpectedly discerning for someone her age, a fact that Dowd discovered when he asked her opinion of his coffee one morning, and she told him plainly that it needed another 30 seconds on the boil, and he went back and reboiled it, and it was, in fact, better. Fletcher thought she was wonderful. This was perhaps the most surprising development of October. He was not a man who had ever demonstrated any particular affinity for children, but Nora's direct manner appealed to something in him, and he took to telling her ranch stories at supper in the tone of someone who had been waiting for an audience who would appreciate them properly. She listened with complete attention and asked follow-up questions, and Fletcher, unused to being listened to quite so carefully, became the most forthcoming version of himself that Clara had yet seen. "She's good for him," Sam told Clara one afternoon. His wrist had healed clean and he'd been back on full work for 3 weeks, and in the evenings they had started going through the surveying mathematics together. "She doesn't let him get away with exaggerating." "Nobody lets Fletcher get away with exaggerating," Clara said, "but she does it without making him feel bad about it. She just asks a question that makes the story fall apart and then looks at him like she's waiting for the real version." He paused. "That's a skill. That's what her mother's people are like," Ethan said from the doorway. He'd come in quiet, which was a habit of his that Clara had stopped startling at. Anne's family. They had a way of cutting straight through to the thing. He looked at Nora, who was across the yard helping Garrett carry feed bags. Insisted on helping, had ignored Garrett's attempt to redirect her to something lighter. "She's more like Anne every day." He said it softly. Not with pain exactly, but with something that had evolved from pain into something else. The complex feeling of loving a resemblance that also costs you something each time you see it. Clara watched him watch Nora, and she thought, he's going to be all right. He's already doing it, the work of being all right. And he doesn't fully see that yet. She didn't say it. There were things that needed to happen in their own time, and this was one of them. James Aldridge arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of November, and Clara knew it was him from the kitchen window before she could see his face because she recognized the gray hat. She stood at the window for exactly 3 seconds. Then she dried her hands, untied her apron, folded it over the counter, and went to the front of the house. He was on the porch. He had knocked, which was interesting. She would have expected him to come around to the kitchen, the working entrance, but he'd come to the front door, which suggested he'd thought about this before arriving. He had his hat in his hands when she opened the door, which he'd taken off, which was either courtesy or calculation. He looked worse than she remembered. Not in any specific way she could point to. He wasn't visibly injured or ill, but the overall impression was of a man who had had a difficult several months and was wearing the evidence of it. Thinner, less certain in his posture, the confidence she'd seen in his back on the platform, that particular ease of a man who hadn't yet paid for his choices, was gone. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. "I was hoping we could talk." She looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said, and led him to the sitting room, which was the front room of the house, and which she used less often than the kitchen. It was Ethan's space more than hers, with his books and his papers, but it was the appropriate room for this conversation. She stood. She did not offer him a seat. "I'll say what I came to say," he said. He seemed to understand from her posture that courtesy would not extend to the long form. "I was wrong. What I did to you on the platform, I was wrong. I should have written to you before you traveled. I should have told you. I didn't, and I've thought about that since." "Why didn't you?" she said. He looked at the floor. "Because I didn't want to have the conversation. Because I thought if I let it happen in person, somehow it would be easier." He looked up. "It wasn't. I know that." "It wasn't easier for me," Clara said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. I had $17 and nowhere to go." "I know." His voice was subdued. "I heard what you'd done. Found work. I was glad." "Are you?" Her voice was even. "Or are you here because things with Miss Marsh didn't work out the way you expected?" He was quiet. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I don't want to be unkind to you. I think you're a man who made a coward's choice and who is now experiencing the consequences of it, and that's as it should be. But I also want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is what I'm owed. Are you here because you want to make amends, or because you want something from me?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear from outside the sound of someone in the yard, the clank of the water pump, one of the men moving between the barn and the bunkhouse. "Both, maybe," he finally said. I'd want a second chance, if there was one to give, if you were willing." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, and she thought about the platform, and the yellow dress, and the $17.40, and the biscuits that bounced, and the cellar fire, and Dowd's wound, and the 2 pine trees in the morning light, and the word "we" that had come out of her mouth without permission, and the way Ethan had used her name for the first time standing in the kitchen doorway. She thought about all of it. "No," she said. It came out clean and simple, which was exactly how it felt. Not angry, not wounded, just true. "There isn't a second chance. I'm not the person I was when I got off that train, Mr. Aldridge, and the life I was coming toward when I got off that train, that isn't the life I want anymore. You did me a favor, even if neither of us knew it at the time." He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Disappointment, maybe, or something close to it, but also something that might have been respect. "You're sure?" "Completely." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "I'm glad you found something," he said. "I mean that." "I believe you do," she said. "Safe travels, Mr. Aldridge." She saw him out. She stood on the porch and watched the gray hat move down the drive and through the gate, and she breathed in the cold November air which smelled like pine and approaching winter, and she felt something in her chest resolve completely, some last remnant of the weight she'd been carrying since August, finished now, settled. She heard a footstep on the porch behind her and turned. Ethan was there. He had seen, or heard, or simply known. She didn't ask which. He looked at her face and seemed to find what he was looking for. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, completely. She looked out at the gate where the gray hat had disappeared into the road. He wanted a second chance. "And?" "I told him no." She paused. "It was an easy thing to say. I thought it might be harder, but it wasn't hard at all." Ethan was quiet beside her for a moment. The November wind moved through the pine trees at the gate. a particular sound like something breathing. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen doorway the night he'd used her name for the first time. Except there was less management to it now, less careful distance between what he was feeling and what his face was doing. "I need to say something, and I'm not practiced at this," he said. "I know," she said. "Take your time." "I think about you," he said slowly, like a man reading a map he's never used before. "More than I have any practical reason to. And I know the situation here is complicated, you work here, and I don't want to make things difficult. But I've found that not saying it is starting to cost me more than saying it would, and I'd rather be honest and have it be awkward than not say it and have that be its own kind of dishonest." She looked at him for a moment. "That was a very long way of saying something quite simple," she said. "Yes." A pause. "I know." "Ethan," she said his name deliberately, the way he'd said hers. "I think about you too. I have for a while. And I'm not a person who says things I don't mean, so you can take that at full value." Something shifted in his face. Not the door coming open from before, but the door swinging wide. "What do we do with that?" he asked. Honestly, not rhetorically, he actually wanted to know. And she found that endearing, this capable man asking that particular question with that particular expression. "We're doing it," she said. "This. Saying it out loud instead of carrying it around. And after that? After that, we go back inside because it's November and I have a venison roast to get in the oven," she said. "And we figure out the rest as we go." He laughed. It was a real laugh, short, surprised, genuine, and it transformed his face in a way she stored carefully. "That seems reasonable," he said. "I'm a reasonable woman," she said, and went back inside. 3 days after James Aldridge's visit, the cattle thieves came. It started on a Saturday night, late, when Clara was already asleep. What woke her was not a sound she could identify, but an absence, some shift in the particular silence of the ranch at night that her body had learned to read in the months she'd been there. She lay in the dark for a moment and then heard it. Voices, low, and the sound of cattle moving. Not the lazy drift of animals shifting in sleep, but the deliberate movement of animals being driven. She got up. Through the kitchen window she could see lantern light in the yard. Not the steady glow of someone going about normal business, but moving light, multiple sources, and the shapes of men who weren't her men moving between the barn and the south pasture gate. She did not hesitate. She went to Ethan's door and knocked, 2 sharp knocks, and said, "Cattle, south pasture. Now." She heard him move immediately. There was no groggy delay. He came awake fast, the way people who have spent their lives in country where things could go wrong at night came awake. And she went to the back of the house and banged on the wall that backed the bunkhouse, 3 times hard, which was the signal they had discussed when Ethan had first explained how emergencies worked at Twin Pines. What happened next was loud and fast, and not entirely under anyone's control. The thieves had numbers on their side, too. She counted at least 5 from the kitchen window, maybe 6. And they had the south pasture gate open and were pushing perhaps 40 head of cattle through it when Pete raised the alarm from the bunkhouse. The men came out armed and loud, which scattered the operation but didn't stop it. And in the chaos of the next 10 minutes, Clara was aware of everything without being able to do anything about most of it. Men running, cattle scattering back and forth, voices raised, the lanterns moving erratically. She stayed in the kitchen. She was not a woman who pretended she could contribute to a physical confrontation she couldn't contribute to. And she knew that the most useful thing she could do was stay out of the way and be ready for whatever came after. She built the fire up and boiled water and gathered the medical supplies from the shelf where she kept them now. Always restocked, always organized, because she had learned in August that you didn't want to be looking for things when things were urgent. She was at the kitchen window when she saw it. Ethan had gone out with the others. She'd seen him go, hat pulled down, rifle in hand, and she'd lost track of him in the darkness and the movement. She saw Fletcher and Garrett and Oscar moving south, driving the remaining thieves back through the gate. She saw Pete cutting cattle back from the road. She saw Sam, against specific instructions, at the edge of the yard with a lantern. She did not see Ethan, and then she did, and her chest went cold. He was on the ground, at the near edge of the south pasture where the fence line met the yard. Two of the men were kneeling over him, and she didn't wait. She was already through the back door with the lamp and across the yard before she'd consciously decided to move. And she pushed through to him and said, "Move." And Pete moved, and she got the lamp close. He had been hit, not shot. That was her first fear, and she checked it immediately, running her hands over him looking for the particular warm wet of a gunshot wound and not finding it. What she found instead was the side of his head, where something had struck him, a club or a rifle butt or the flat of something heavy, and the cut above his ear that was bleeding with the alarming generosity that head wounds produced. And beneath it, more concerning, the particular way he was not quite conscious. "Ethan," she said. His eyes were open but not focused. He was in that half place, present and not present, and she recognized it as what the medical guide called concussive injury, and what she recognized as dangerous. "Miss Bennett," Pete said from behind her. "I need him inside," she said. "Carefully. His head. Be careful of his head." She looked up. "Pete, is it over?" "They ran," Pete said. "We lost maybe 15 head." "Is anyone else hurt?" "Webb's got a cut on his arm. Nothing bad." "Get Webb inside too, then. Someone watch that south gate until morning." She looked back at Ethan, who had, in the last 30 seconds, become more present. His eyes had focused slightly, and she could see him working to track her face. "Clara," he said. The word came out thick. "Right here," she said. "Don't try to get up. Let the men help you." He didn't argue, which told her the hit had been serious. Ethan Cross did not generally allow people to help him move. They got him inside and onto the bed in his room, which she'd never been in before. It was spare and clean, a working man's room with a single window and a hook for his hat and a stack of books on the floor beside the bed that she'd look at another time. She examined the wound properly by lamplight, and what she found was concerning without being catastrophic. The cut itself was not deep enough to require suturing, but the area beneath was swollen in a way that told her the blow had been hard, and his responses were slow in ways that frightened her. She cleaned the wound, she bound it, she kept him awake, which was the thing the medical guide had been most insistent about. With head injuries, the worst thing was to let the patient sleep without monitoring. She sat beside the bed and she talked to him, which she'd read was useful, and she asked him questions to track his cognition, and she did all of this in the steady, contained way she had been developing for months, the way of a person who has decided that competence is more useful than panic. But underneath that containment, in the part of herself she wasn't showing, she was genuinely afraid. Not the generic fear of a medical situation, but the specific fear of losing a specific person, and that specificity told her something she hadn't quite finished admitting to herself on the porch 3 days ago. "You're staring at me," Ethan said, maybe an hour in. His voice was clearer, the responses were faster. Good signs, both. "I'm monitoring you," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "How many fingers?" He looked at her hand. 3. She put down 2 fingers. "And now?" 2. "I'm not concussed, Clara." "You might be lightly concussed. The distinction matters." She sat back in the chair. "Can you tell me what day it is?" "Saturday." "What happened?" "Someone hit me from behind near the fence line. I didn't see him coming." He paused, and she could see the effort of the recollection, which told her the hit had scrambled things temporarily. "Did we lose many?" 15 head. Everyone else is all right. Webb has a cut." He was quiet. 15 head isn't catastrophic." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. Could have been worse. And it could have," she said. And then, because she had decided on the porch 3 days ago that she was going to stop carrying things around that needed to be said, "It could have been considerably worse, and I want you to know that the thought of that—" She stopped. "I'm saying this badly." He turned his head toward her carefully, in the way of someone managing pain. "You're not saying it badly." "I was frightened," she said. "When I saw you on the ground, I was genuinely frightened, and not just in the way of someone responsible for the people around them. In a—" stopped again. "A more personal way." The room was quiet. The lamp burned low. Outside, she could hear Pete's voice and the distant movement of the men still working the south end of the property. "Clara," Ethan said. "You should sleep," she said. "I'll sit here until I'm sure it's safe for you to sleep." "That could be several hours." "Then it's several hours." He looked at her. His eyes were more focused now, more like his usual self. The gray-green that was hard to read and that she'd spent 3 months learning to read anyway. All right, he said, stay. I'll stay, she said. Then I want to say something while you're here. He was quiet for a moment, gathering it. I was thinking on the ground out there, when I was trying to figure out what had happened, I was thinking about the kitchen, the light in the kitchen window. He paused. That was the thing I was trying to get back to. That specific thing. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she had words for it. I don't know what to do with that exactly, he said. I'm still working on it, but I thought you should know. I know, she said quietly. She sat in the chair beside his bed through the hours of the night, while the ranch settled back into quiet, and the fire burned down in the kitchen, and Nora slept upstairs and the men went back to the bunkhouse one by one. She sat, and she watched him breathe, and she thought about all the plans she'd ever made that had come undone, and the strange, stubborn, imperfect life that had been waiting on the other side of their undoing. Around 3 a.m, when she was satisfied his breathing was steady and his responses clear, she let herself take his hand. Not in a romantic way exactly. Practically, the way you held the hand of someone who had been hurt, the gesture that said, I'm here, I'm not leaving. His hand was large and calloused and warm. And after a moment his fingers closed around hers with the particular pressure of someone who is grateful for the thing they wouldn't have known to ask for. She did not sleep. She sat through the rest of the night in that chair, watching the light in the window go from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a Colorado November morning. And by the time the ranch started waking around her, she had done what she had been doing since August, which was make up her mind about what she was going to do next. She was going to stay. Not because she had to. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She'd had nowhere else to go in August. But it was November now. And if she'd wanted to leave, she could have. She had money saved. She had the kind of competence that would find a position somewhere. She was going to stay because this was where she wanted to be. Because these rough, difficult, imperfect people had become her people. And this cold, beautiful country had become her country. And this man whose hand was warm around hers had become, in whatever complicated and uncertain way, a person she was choosing. Choosing. That was the word. Not settling into, not falling into by accident, choosing, with her eyes open, on the basis of everything she now knew. She thought about the girl on the platform with $17.40. She thought, look where you are now. Look what you built. Ethan stirred in the early morning light. His eyes opened, clear, focused, himself. He looked at her face and then at their joined hands and back at her face. You stayed, he said. I said I would, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, Clara, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it now, while I haven't had time to talk myself out of it. She waited. Would you stay? He said. Not as the cook, would you stay because you want to? She looked at him, at the gray-green eyes in the morning light, at the man who had turned a coffee cup in his hands in a saloon in Harlow Creek and offered honest work to a woman with nowhere to go and no cooking experience, and $17.40, who had held a lamp steady while she sutured a wound by lamplight, who had laughed, really laughed, on a November porch and asked, what do we do with that, like he actually needed to know. I already am, she said. The morning came in through the window. Outside, she could hear the ranch waking up. The water pump, boots on the bunkhouse steps, Nora's voice saying something to Fletcher from the direction of the barn. Fletcher's laugh. The ordinary sound of a day beginning. Her day. Her people. Her life. Imperfect and hard-won, and entirely, completely hers. She held his hand in the morning light. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Ethan recovered. Not quickly. That was the first thing Clara had to manage, not in him but in herself, because she had a tendency, she was discovering, to decide something was finished before it actually was. His head healed clean, the swelling came down within a week, and the cut above his ear closed into a thin scar that his hair would cover entirely by spring. But he tired more easily than he wanted to admit for nearly a month, and there were headaches he didn't tell her about until she noticed him pressing 2 fingers to his temple in the evenings and asked him directly. They're manageable, he said. That's not what I asked, she said. He told her after that. It was a small thing, that telling, but it was not nothing. For a man who had spent 3 years managing everything alone, telling someone about a headache was its own kind of step. She made him rest. This was, practically speaking, like trying to make the Colorado wind change direction, but she was persistent, and she had learned his particular stubbornness well enough by now to work around its edges rather than against its face. She took on more of the ranch communication in the weeks of his recovery, the letters to suppliers, the conversation with Pete about the south pasture fence, the inventory of what they'd actually lost in the theft. And she did it without making a production of it, without announcing that she was doing it, just doing it because it needed to be done. Pete Hale, watching this, said nothing. But one morning he came into the kitchen before breakfast and stood in the doorway in his usual way and said, "Miss Bennett?" And she said, "Mr. Hale." And he said, "I've been on this ranch for 11 years. And she said, "I know." And he said, "I'd be glad if you stayed." And she said, "I intend to." And he nodded once and went out. And that was all the ceremony there was. And it was exactly the right amount. They married in February, on a Saturday, in the sitting room of the main house with Pete Hale and Oscar Pruitt as witnesses, and Nora standing beside Clara with the expression of a person trying very hard not to show how much something matters. It was not an elaborate occasion. Clara had not wanted elaborate. She had spent enough of her life deferring to what occasions were supposed to look like, and she found, at 30 years old in a Colorado sitting room with snow coming down outside the window, that she had no patience left for what things were supposed to look like versus what they actually were. What it actually was, two people who had found each other through a series of events neither would have chosen, and both, in retrospect, were glad for, standing in a warm room and saying plainly what they'd already said in all the ways that weren't words. The justice of the peace drove out from Harlow Creek in a wagon that was not built for February, and he stamped his feet clear of snow on the porch and came inside and performed the ceremony with businesslike efficiency. And when it was done, he accepted a cup of coffee and a slice of the apple cake Clara had made, the recipe from Edna's book, the one she and Nora had worked on together through the fall, and drove back to town. Fletcher, who had not been in the sitting room for the ceremony because he had been loudly indifferent to the whole thing for weeks, appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 15 minutes after it was over and said, without looking at either of them, "All right then," and then went back to the barn. Dowd cried. He denied this later, but he cried. Sam Briggs shook Ethan's hand and then turned to Clara and said with the solemnity of a young man making a formal statement, "You're the best teacher I ever had." Then he turned very red and went to stand near the window. Nora hugged Clara. She did it quickly and without warning, the way children do when they've been holding something back long enough that it comes out all at once. And then she stepped back and looked at the middle distance as though the hug had not occurred, which Clara respected completely. That night, after the house had settled, Clara stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea and looked at the two pine trees at the gate. They were dark shapes against the snow, enormous and still, the same as they'd been on the morning she first came through that gate, in a wagon beside a man she barely knew, thinking about biscuits and $17.40, and the particular terror of having no plan. She thought about the girl on the platform, the one who had walked off with her spine straight because the only alternative was to stay and be pitied, and she had decided in that moment that she would rather be moving in any direction than standing still in the wrong place. She had not known then what direction she was moving in. She'd only known the movement was necessary. That seemed worth remembering, not as a lesson packaged neatly for export, but as a plain fact about how things actually worked. You rarely knew where you were going when you most needed to move. You just had to trust the moving. Ethan came into the kitchen, his kitchen now too, though it had always been his, but now differently, and stood behind her and looked at whatever she was looking at, which was the trees and the snow and the dark. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The platform," she said. He was quiet. He understood by now what the platform meant in her private vocabulary. It was shorthand for everything that had come before, the version of her life that had been derailed on a hot August afternoon and that she'd had to walk away from on foot. "Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" he said. "Complicated thoughts," she said. "Mostly good." She turned her head to look at him. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come into Ruth's saloon that day?" "Sometimes," he said. "I try not to. It's a bad road to go down." "I know." She looked back at the trees. But sometimes I think about it just to, she searched for the right word, to appreciate the accident of it, that I was sitting in that particular place at that particular time, and you happened to need a cook. And you happened to be honest about not being one, he said. That too. She smiled, not at him, but at the window. $17.40. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they stood at the kitchen window in the quiet of a February night, while the snow came down on Twin Pines and the fire burned in the stove behind them, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things don't need saying to be understood. The years that followed were not simple. Clara had not expected them to be. There were hard winters. The winter of 1889 was the worst she would experience at Twin Pines, when the temperature dropped to levels she had not believed possible, and 3 of the cattle died in a single night, and Ethan spent 2 weeks cutting through ice to get the herd to water, and came in each evening so cold that it took an hour by the fire before he stopped shaking. There were dry summers when the grass went thin and the cattle dropped weight, and the calculations of the ranch became the kind of calculations that kept people awake at 3 in the morning. There were arguments. She and Ethan argued the way 2 honest, opinionated people argue when they live and work together. Not meanly, but with conviction, about real things. How to handle a dispute with a neighboring ranch over water rights, whether to expand the herd faster than she thought was prudent, what to do about a hired hand who was causing problems in ways that Ethan wanted to address one way and Clara thought he was handling wrong. They argued, and they were not always right in equal measure, and sometimes one of them was simply wrong and had to account for it, and they learned to do that without it becoming something larger than what it was. That, Clara thought, was the part nobody told you about. Not the love, people talked about that even when they talked around it, but the sustained practical work of 2 people deciding every day to keep choosing each other. Not because it was always easy, because it was worth it. In the spring of 1889, a year after the wedding, their first child was born. A boy they named William, who arrived ahead of schedule on a March morning when the doctor from Denton had not yet been sent for, and who was therefore delivered by Clara herself, with Ethan beside her, and Pete Hale pacing in the kitchen so thoroughly that he wore a visible groove in the floor. William was healthy and loud and had Ethan's gray eyes and Clara's stubbornness, which manifested early and remained consistent. 2 years later, a daughter. Margaret, who everyone called Maggie, who was quieter than her brother, and quicker in ways that reminded Clara, privately, of herself at the same age, watchful, precise, capable of noticing things that other people missed. In between and after, the ranch grew. Not explosively. Ethan was not a man who believed in growth for its own sake, and Clara had learned enough about the economics of the territory to share his caution, but steadily in the way of things built to last. They expanded the herd carefully, acquired 2 additional pasture parcels when the opportunity arose at prices that made sense, built a proper smokehouse and a larger cold cellar, and eventually a second bunkhouse when the crew size made the first one insufficient. By 1892, they were running 600 head, which made Twin Pines one of the larger operations in that part of the territory, and by 1895 the name had the particular currency in the county that came not from boasting but from consistent performance over time. Clara ran the household and more. She had not set out to become involved in the business side of the ranch. She had set out to make competent biscuits and not quit. But it turned out that the same qualities that had gotten her through those first terrible weeks in the kitchen were useful in other contexts, and Ethan had figured this out before she had, and had simply started bringing her into the conversations that needed it. She had a head for numbers and a clear sense of what things were worth and what they weren't, and she was not intimidated by men who assumed she shouldn't be in the room, because she had been underestimated before and had learned that it was, practically speaking, an advantage. Sam Briggs left Twin Pines in the spring of 1890, which was expected and which Clara had been preparing for. He had been studying surveying in earnest for over a year. Evenings, their mathematics sessions, a correspondence course he'd enrolled in with money he'd saved, and when he came to tell her he'd been offered a position with a land survey company in Denver, she said, "Good. When do you leave?" He looked at her. "You're not going to tell me I should stay?" "Why would I tell you that? The whole point was for you to go." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that you—" He stopped, tried again. "The things you did for me here. I know what they were. You did the work, she said. I just pointed. Clara. He only used her given name occasionally when something was serious. You pointed in the right direction. That's not nothing. That's everything. She looked at him. This boy who had come to her kitchen with a healing wrist and his grandmother's bean recipe and a hunger for something he couldn't name. And she thought about what it meant to give someone a direction without giving them the destination. That was the thing, she had come to believe. You couldn't carry people to where they needed to go. You could only show them the road was there and trust them to walk it. Right when you're settled, she said. He did. He wrote for years. Bo? Nora Cross. Nora Bennett. Cross, because she'd asked at 14 if she could add Clara's name, which Clara had said yes to so quickly that Nora had laughed in surprise, grew up at Twin Pines and eventually left it, which was exactly what Clara had hoped for and exactly what she would have expected from a girl who had survived loss at 12 with her dignity intact and her curiosity unbroken. She became a teacher. She trained in Denver and taught for 7 years in 3 different Colorado towns before she married a man named Thomas Reyes, who built houses, and who, Clara noted when she first met him, spoke to Nora the way Ethan spoke to Clara, as though what she said mattered and was worth the full weight of attention. That was enough. That was what Clara had decided to look for, and she had found it. Nora came back to Twin Pines every Christmas, every year until she couldn't, and then her children came. That was how it went. Fletcher stayed at Twin Pines for 16 more years after Clara arrived, until his knees gave out and made ranch work impractical, at which point he retired to a small house in Harlow Creek and became, according to everyone who encountered him, deeply and persistently critical of the younger generation's work ethic. Clara visited him occasionally, and he was always glad to see her, and he always pretended not to be, and she found this charming rather than annoying, which was perhaps the best measure of how far they'd come from the man who had eaten her biscuits in contemptuous silence in the first week of her arrival. Dowd never left. He was still at Twin Pines, slower and gray-bearded, 20 years on, a fixture of the place in the way that the 2 pine trees were a fixture, simply part of what Twin Pines was. He had a habit of telling the newer hands about the early days, embellished only slightly, and his account of Clara's arrival and the first terrible biscuits and the fence wire accident had become something close to ranch mythology, told and retold until the details had the smooth, worn quality of stones in a riverbed. He did not, in any version of the story, mention that he'd been afraid. Clara, hearing one of these tellings by accident, did not correct him. Matpong. In the autumn of 1905, 18 years after Clara Bennett had stepped off a train in Harlow Creek, Colorado, with a worn leather trunk and $17.40. She was standing at the kitchen window of the main house at Twin Pines watching her daughter Maggie teach something to her 2 youngest grandchildren in the yard. Maggie was 33, which was improbable. William was 35, which was equally improbable. They had children who ran around the yard of a ranch that was, by now, a significant piece of the territory. 1,200 acres, nearly 1,000 head, a crew of 15, a reputation that had been built not through luck or inheritance, but through the kind of work that left marks on hands and backs and the corners of eyes. Ethan came into the kitchen. He was 60 years old, and he moved with the slight deliberateness of a man who had asked a great deal of his body for a great many years and was now negotiating with it more carefully. He stood beside her at the window and looked at Maggie and the children. "She's showing them how to read the weather," he said. "I know." Clara had watched Maggie develop this particular skill over years. Her daughter had an instinct for the land that was half learned and half something she'd been born with, the way some people were born with perfect pitch. "She gets that from you. She gets the stubbornness from you. She gets the stubbornness from both of us," Clara said. "The results are compounded." He made a sound that was half laugh, half agreement. They stood at the window together, the way they had stood at countless windows over 18 years of mornings and evenings, and Clara thought about what it meant to have built something. Not just the ranch was visible, countable, measurable in acres and head and dollars. She meant the other thing, the thing that was harder to put a number on. She had come here with nothing, less than nothing, with a plan that had just collapsed, with the particular humiliation of having been publicly discarded, with the knowledge that the life she'd been building toward was not going to happen, and she was going to have to figure out what came instead. What came instead was this, and here was what she had come to believe. In 18 years of building it, the life you plan is the life you think you deserve. The life you build from wreckage. That's the life that shows you what you're actually made of. James Aldridge had given her $17.40 worth of humiliation, and in exchange, she had gotten a kitchen and a stove she'd learned like a difficult friend, and 8 rough men who had become her people, and a girl with her mother's eyes who now wrote letters from a schoolhouse in Pueblo, and a boy who ran the East Pasture operations with the same particular care his father had, and a man who came to stand beside her at kitchen windows, and still, sometimes, turned a coffee cup in his hands when he was thinking, which she found she would never stop finding endearing. She had not planned any of it. That, she thought, was perhaps the point. "Ethan," she said. Do you remember what you said to me that first night when I'd made beans and cornbread and potatoes?" He thought about it. "I said the potatoes were good." "You did." She looked out at the yard where one of the grandchildren had apparently done something that made Maggie laugh. That bright, unself-conscious laugh that she'd had since she was small. "I think about that sometimes, that I was holding myself together with both hands, and the thing that helped was someone telling me the potatoes were good." "I meant it," he said. "I know you did. That's why it helped." She paused. "The truth helps, even when it's small." He put his arm around her, the same gesture as that February night 18 years ago, and she leaned into it the same way. Some things didn't need to change. "Was it worth it?" he said. "Everything it took to get here?" She looked at the yard, at her daughter and her grandchildren, and the 2 enormous pine trees standing at the gate exactly where they'd always stood, holding it open. At the mountains beyond, close and blue in the autumn air. At the kitchen around her, which was not Edna Marsh's kitchen anymore, and hadn't been for a long time. "Ask me something harder," she said. He laughed. She felt it against her shoulder. Outside, Maggie was pointing at the sky, explaining clouds to children who would grow up knowing how to read weather and make biscuits and tend to people who were hurt and choose, when life handed them the chance, to stay in the place where they were needed and wanted and known. Clara Bennett Cross had come to Colorado with nowhere to go. She had built a somewhere. That was the whole of it. That was the lesson, if there was one, and she didn't think of it as a lesson so much as a plain fact she'd had to learn the hard way. You could not always choose what happened to you, but you could always choose what you did next, even when you had nothing, especially then. The choice to keep moving, to keep building, to decide that the worst day of your life was the foundation of something rather than the end of it, that was not a gift. It was not luck. It was a decision made again and again and again. Every morning you got up and started the fire and put the coffee on and faced whatever the day had for you. It was the most ordinary kind of courage. And it was, she had found, enough, more than enough. It was everything.